So as Paulette mentioned, the theme of today's event, From Earth to Sky, Women Making a Difference in Geography, is more relevant today, I think, than ever before. Sometimes things can look pretty bleak, and it's really easy to get discouraged with the monumental challenges that are facing our Earth and its living populations. But then I hear about the work being done by passionate, intelligent people like the women we're going to hear from and about today, and it really gives me hope. This is why I'm so excited to be here today, all the way from St. Louis, not only because I get to represent SWG, but because I get to sit in the audience and listen to the stories of these women who are working tirelessly to bring positive change to our world. And like Paulette said, as we go through today, if you are sharing your experience today on social media, please do use the hashtag #ChangeMakers to continue on with that theme. So a few housekeeping details. In the interest of time, speaker intros are going to be very brief, and speaker bios were sent via email prior to the conference, and there's also some copies out on the table out front. Also, after each presentation, we are going to forego the typical Q&A session to allow our speakers the maximum amount of time to share their work. So we invite you to connect with our speakers during the breaks and after the conference if you'd like to talk to them further. We are going to break for lunch for about an hour on your own, and options for lunch were also sent out prior to the conference, but there's some copies out front as well. And then once the conference concludes, we're all invited to tour the Geography and Map Reading Room in the Madison Building. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my biggest supporter, my mom, Gwen Whitaker, for being with me here today. And I'll wrap up with a quote from fellow SWG member Jane Goodall from her New Year's message from last year. There is still so much in the world worth fighting for. So much that is beautiful. So many wonderful people working to reverse the harm, to help alleviate the suffering. And so many young people dedicated to making this a better world. All conspiring to inspire us and give us hope that it is not too late to turn things around if we all do our part. The women that we'll hear from today are part of that group that Dr. Goodall is talking about. To get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Van Blagoy, Executive Director of SWG, to come up and tell us about SWG and the remarkable stories of its members. Thank you.
So Paulette let me know about the change makers in terms of the theme for the Library of Congress, and so I changed my presentation to reflect that. And I want to talk about the amazing women of SWG, the Society of Women Geographers. But first, I need to give you a little history about it. The Society of Women Geographers was founded in 1925 by these four women that you see here. What they aimed at was providing a forum for women to meet, network, and share their accomplishments, since they were not allowed to join men's clubs, such as the Explorers Club, the National Geographic here in DC, as well as the Cosmos Club in DC. They were looking for validation for the work that they were doing, but also to share such things as, where do you find your guides, especially because of my sex? You know, women weren't allowed to go on ships at a time before all of this. They weren't allowed to go down to the Antarctic. Men would not allow them on their expeditions. And so these women travelers, they went and forged it on their own. Margaret Harrison, who is second from the right here, as you see her, she said at one point, and I'm going to bring this up in the later 20th century, when we returned, we had all been not a little annoyed at being interviewed by reports who seemed convinced that the public would be interested chiefly in finding out whether I had used lipstick in the Gobi Desert. So that's what these women were facing, and that is why they wanted to form this organization. Margaret Harrison had a tremendous resume. She was a movie producer of Grass, which you can actually see on the internet. She was an explorer, author, lecturer, specialist on Russia and Persia, and also a spy in Russia. In fact, she was caught twice. So this is one lady that you don't want to mess around with. Blair Niles, who is on the far right here, I will talk about her later on. Gertrude Matthews Shelby, who is here on the left, she was an economic consultant. And what's amazing about her is that this was a woman with only a high school degree, but when she spoke on economic matters, others listened, including Congress. Her book, How to Face Peace, is a classic on how to help countries recover after a war. She, of course, was another traveler who explored the world and commented on the economics of the places she visited, to which people took notice. This is why these women wanted to form something like this, because they needed to talk about it. They needed to share their accomplishments and also, again, that validation. And then lastly, Gertrude Sen here, oh, I love her outfit. One of the things she said was that there's no chance for the welfare of the world unless the condition of women is improved. It is not possible for a bird to fly only on one wing. This was a woman who was wanted to break down the barriers, be equals to men, and change the world. That's what these women were about. And Gertrude Zen would be part of the Asian magazine, and she would contribute to it so much so that she did not come back to the United States. She was the only one to graduate from the University of Chicago, and we must remember a lot of times women did not have access to higher education at this time. So again, these women were forging ahead, making their own way. Well, very quickly, when they decided to form this organization, they brought on Harriet Chalmers Adams. She was the organizer and the first president. Now, these four women were up in New York. Harriet Adams was down here in DC. She was another traveler. She submitted articles and gave lectures to National Geographic. Although she was quite popular as a writer and lecturer at National Geographic, she was not allowed to be a full member. Through her lectures, she met other American women explorers who were just as frustrated as she was that they were invited to speak like at the Explorers Club or National Geographic, but never invited to membership. And she said, quote, "I wonder why men have to absolutely monopolize the field of exploration. I never found my sex a hindrance, never faced a difficulty which a woman as well as a man could not surmount, never felt a fear of danger, never lacked courage to protect myself. I've been in tight places and have seen harrowing things." And as a result of Harriet Adams, she really organized our society, and she came up with the following objectives of the society itself. And that was to form a medium of contact between women, again, that forum for women to share their experiences, to validate their experiences and their accomplishments. And of course, they wanted to further geographical work, to spread knowledge, to also encourage research, and finally to financially support women, because this was very important. This is at a time when women, they cannot raise the funds to do this on their own. Many of these women had to work very hard and use their own earnings to go out and explore the world. So let's talk about how the society has done that through the years. First of all, through their meetings. This is a great New York group luncheon that they had in 1931, and I just want to point out some of the members. This is a young Margaret Mead that you see here in the middle. Blair Niles is next to her. See here, Blair Niles, and then there's Gertrude Shelby, Gertrude Sen, and then down here is Annie S. Peck, who was a famous climber, as I'm sure that you all know. Annie came into the organization and she spent about 10 years in its membership, and she was another woman who was fearless. Nothing was going to stop her from exploring the world. And then, of course, we have the DC group that formed here in the 1931, and we have Harriet Adams right here in the corner sitting down. So that was one way that these women came together to validate their accomplishments and to share them. Another way was that they published a bulletin, which was first published in 1929, and today we still publish this bulletin. And this was very important because this was another way for women to network. The bulletin fulfilled in that sense by giving contact information on the women, their interests, as well as publishing these women's accomplishments. That was very, very important because these women weren't being recognized for the work that they were doing. And then, of course, they established a flag carrier program. Since you couldn't belong in National Geographic or the Explorers Club, where they did have a flag carrier program, who was going to endorse you? Well, SWG decided that they were going to take that on, and that's exactly what they did. And so through the years, the flag has been carried by various women going to various places up to the sky and down through the oceans. And then, of course, what was more important to all of these women was the fact that they established an awards program. We have a gold medal program. We also have an outstanding achievement program, as well as the program for Ronnie Award for Antarctic Research and Exploration. So let's talk about some of these awardees as change makers in the field, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 22 of them. Amelia Earhart was one of the first ones. And I think Amelia Earhart is very important in terms of when we talk about gender, and that's going to be my theme today in talking about these change makers and what they did for their sex. We know now that gender is a social construction itself, how the very meaning of categories man and woman vary according to time, context, and place, how these categories develop into roles and identities for men and women to fill and become perceived as natural. And then, of course, how the issues of power and rights play into this. So in 1927, Charles Lindbergh, that is, flew solo across the Atlantic. In 1928, Amelia Earhart flew as a passenger, 2 pilots in front, across the Atlantic. What did the paper say about all of this? Well, of course, they compared Earhart to Charles Lindbergh, not the other way around, and they said, well, first Lindbergh made a record for men, and now Earhart has made one for women. Now, Earhart was very much dismayed by this, and she felt that the other 2 pilots should receive credit. The other disturbing thing was the fact that she was a pilot herself, but she could only go as a passenger. To prove women were capable of flying, Earhart flew solo over the Atlantic in 1932, and she was the second person to do so. So she felt that she had to prove herself to the world out there and make change for women. Now, at the time that Earhart started flying in the early 1920s, aviation was a new profession that welcomed both men and women, and Earhart had envisioned great potential for women to get into this particular field and explore the world. However, as the industry developed, women were quickly marginalized. It soon became clear women were welcome as stewardesses, but not as pilots. They could demonstrate light sports craft, but were denied access to heavier commercial and military aircraft. They were physically, quote unquote, too weak to handle these larger planes. And women who wanted to train as pilots faced large obstacles. Men could get their training through the military, and of course women were denied access to that. Or they could just be out on the airstrip looking for something, whereas a woman would be seen as loose and prostituting herself. So they didn't have an avenue there either. Then grew the widespread suspicion that women were incapable of flying, no matter what their records were against men. The Commerce Department issued an advisory limiting women to fly only in fair weather and had considered grounding female pilots for 9 days a month during menstruation. And just like the makeup story, I'm going to bring this up later on. Another change maker was Margaret Mead. She was the second one to receive the gold medal. Margaret Mead, in her oral history, said she was invited to join SWG in 1929. According to this interview that was conducted at the American Natural History Museum in 1974, where she worked, she said that she decided to join because it would be a good way to meet the men who were her colleagues in the museum. She wasn't sure which women of SWG invited her to join. However, their husbands were members of the museum staff. That she knew. So she took a look at that membership list, and she figured this would be a good way to meet the men. As a woman, of course, she was not invited out to drinks or the various clubs because of her gender. There wasn't anything she ever got invited to with the men. So SWG, she thought, was a great way to get acquainted with her colleagues. Think of that, she's working in the same place with them. And so she did through SWG events and meetings where she was able to socialize with them and discuss her work and advance her career. There was an interesting question from the interviewer that asked, I wonder if SWG had an influence on your career. Margaret Mead replied, except to the extent that, well, it's exceedingly indirect. It was the cases where, in knowing the men better than I would have known them under conditions of working, that in turn led to these research projects. So that's kind of a roundabout way where she gets to the fact that, again, this was the only way she was going to meet her colleagues and to talk about her work. Blair Niles, one of the founders, as I mentioned before, she was an amazing woman in herself. She wrote a number of novels and nonfiction books based on her travels. In them, she sought to explore the human condition. In fact, in 1927, she became the first white woman to visit Devil's Island. And this was a notorious penal colony in Suriname, and she was also one of the first women to explore homosexuality. So here's another woman changing the world. So she was ahead of her time. Now let's jump kind of to the late 20th century. Arlene Blum, she is one of our members, and in 1978, she organized a team of 11 women to climb, and I'm not going to say the mountain because I'm going to butcher this whole name, but in Nepal, which until then had been climbed by only 8 people, all men. She called it the American Women's Himalayan Expeditions, and they raised money for the trip by selling t-shirts with the slogan, "A woman's place is at the top." And it truly is. And she is an amazing, amazing scientist. She was here 2 weeks ago at one of our meetings and educating our folks at the Capitol over here on the work that she's doing. And then I want to bring up Katherine Sullivan. I don't know how many of you have read the paper in the last week, but last week the news reported that history was supposed to be made with the first all-female spacewalk at the International Space Station. I see some heads nodding, yes. They then reported that NASA was scrapping the plan because they didn't have enough spacesuits designed for smaller frames that typically characterize the female body. And this is not something I wrote. This is what I'm taking from the Washington Post and such. They asked Katherine Sullivan for a comment, and she did comment that it was too bad. But they also brought up another story. Sally Ride, who has passed away in 2012, they were asking her about her whole experience in all of this. And think about this. I mean, these are remarkable women. They are change makers. They are the women who allow us to do these things. Sally Ride, she wasn't never a member of SWG, but she remarked in an earlier interview on how the engineers at NASA, in their infinite wisdom, again, I'm not making this up, decided that women astronauts would want makeup, so they designed a makeup kit. And they actually had a picture of this makeup kit in the Post. The article in the Washington Post then showed Sullivan, like this, for example, the first American woman to go on a spacewalk, and asked, can you tell whether she's wearing space makeup? So does this remind you of Marguerite Harrison wearing makeup in the Gobi Desert? I mean, come on, we've come a long way, haven't we? Then going back to Amelia Earhart, engineers also asked Sally Ride, and I'm sure Katherine Sullivan, about tampons. To Ride, they asked, is 100 the right number? She would be in space for a week. Thankfully, Ride told them that would not be the right number. This is why we need women at the top. I'm not going to talk about Susan Shaw because she'll be talking later on, but here's another woman who is really a change maker in herself, and you'll hear that today. And then, of course, we have Rebecca Lee, who's a photographer and writer. She's recognized as the first Hong Kong woman explorer to have reached the Arctic, Antarctic, and Mount Everest region, taking photographs to document climate change. She also opened the first museum dedicated to climate change in Hong Kong itself. So these women are doing amazing things and making sure that we take care of our world. And then lastly, with the gold medalist, I want to talk about Costanza Cerruti. She sends her greetings to all of you. She's another one who talks about all the time how men are taking credit for the work that she has done and how she has to face down that still today in terms of being recognized for that credit. So that's something that SWG has done for her, and she is so grateful for that, being validated for the work that she has really, truly done, and that there are other people who recognize it as well. So the gold medal has been extremely important for all of these women in changing attitudes about women in geography and its allied fields. And then I mentioned that we also have the Outstanding Achievement Award, and that went to one of our members as well, and that's Clara Legare. She worked here at the Library of Congress, and Jan Monk, who's sitting in the audience, has written about her. She was honored for founding the Geography and Map Division of the Special Libraries Association, and also for her expertise in historical cartography and indexing an 8-volume list of geographical atlases for the Library of Congress. And so that, again, you can see that connection between, and we'll see that also today, between SWG members, the Library of Congress, and such, and making all of those networks work together so that we can improve geography for everyone. And then other ways that SWG has supported women is through their fellowship programs. We have 2 or 3 fellowship programs, I should say. One is in New York, the other one is the Evelyn Pruitt Fellowship, and so let me just go over those a little bit. In 1949, the SWG members, again, 4 members got together in New York and decided they wanted to financially support women who were in graduate school, and so they began to raise money. At that time, in 1953-54, they were able to give at least $800 to a woman at Columbia University. Then, after that point, Adeline Moffett, who was an SWG member, she left her estate so that we were able to set up a trust fund and able to give out approximately today over $8,000 for women to complete their degrees. Although the New York Fellowship went that way, other members contributed to a fellowship fund here in DC that we continue today, and that one they were giving out money as well. And then wonderful Evelyn Pruitt left her money, roughly $900,000 in 2000-2001, and we established this program as well. And so today we're able to give out between 8 and 12 awards, up to $12,000 for graduate students who are working on their dissertations. And they can use it for anything and everything except for tuition. And that's, I think, and we're going to hear from some of our SWG fellows how important all of these fellowships are to them. And then, of course, we also have a minority Pruitt Fellowship, and that one, between 2 and 4 students sign up for that and or receive applications for that, and we're able to give up to $4,000 so that they can finish their master's degree. So these are very important fellowship programs to support women in geography and the work that they're doing, and we get the top best geographers that apply. And Jan Monk down there was recently our fellowship chair. She just retired this year, and she can tell you all about the program and the women who have applied and have done a great job. And so again, you'll hear from our fellowship winners over here. And then, so here we can see today, because I'm connecting it to the AAG meeting, here are some change makers today, and there's Jan right here in the middle. This was last year at the AAG meeting in New Orleans where our fellows were presenting their papers. Lastly, I want to talk about our oral history program, and here's another change maker, Marie Tharp. One of the great things is that in the 1970s, SWG started a oral history program, and that's very important in the sense that, again, documenting these people's lives, women's lives, I should say, because that wasn't being done before. And so there is, one of the things that we've done, we've had over 80 oral histories that have been conducted, and they go to the Library of Congress so that they are available to the public. So it's not only the recordings, but also the transcripts. And then, of course, we keep a copy too. And our researchers have used them to talk about other, former SWG members, and also to produce films, to produce books, and all of that. So this has been a very important program in itself, and it's something that we continue to do today. If you don't know Marie, Judith Tyner, another one of our SWG members, has written extensively on her. Marie Tharp is best known as a woman in cartography, and we know that there are at least 2 oral histories of her, one done by us and another one by somebody else, and all of her materials are now at the Library of Congress documenting her career. Now, just to give you an idea of what women faced and how she changed things, she was born in 1920, and that she said she owed her career, and a lot of women have said this to me, I've heard before, to World War II, because a lot of times the job market was decimated with the men leaving, and so they needed somebody to fill them in. When she had originally entered Ohio University about 1939, the careers open to women at that time were secretary, nurse, or teacher. She said she couldn't type, she couldn't stand the sight of blood, so that left teaching, although that really didn't interest her. When the war came along, she was able to go to work and was hired by Columbia's University Geological Observatory. The main qualification that interested her boss was not her degrees and such, but was her ability to draft. So she began working with another person by the name of Bruce Henson, another newcomer to the lab. Bruce was a PhD student, and he went to sea taking soundings while Marie remained on shore. At this time, women, of course, were not allowed on Navy ships. So she converted these soundings to elevation maps that you see here. So this is an incredible thing to do when you haven't even been on a ship. Marie noticed a rift valley in the mid-Atlantic ridge. When she showed it to Bruce, he dismissed it as girl talk, because it would support the theory of continental drift, then considered a crackpot idea. And then, of course, ultimately, Marie's discovery changed the face of geology. So again, here's another person fighting through the bureaucracy and ideas about what women can do and not do. So I would like to end on this. This is what a geographer looks like, and these are the people that you're going to meet today. Women have pushed through the barriers and opened doors, and so as a result of that, we have a great group speaking today about their experiences as well as the wonderful work they are doing. Thank you. So next, I would like to bring up Nancy Lewis, and let me just get this up for you, Nancy. Nancy has been a long-time SWG member, and I met her a few years ago when she stopped by my office, and I can't tell you what a delight she's been to get to know her. Thank you, Mary.
Well, that was very inspirational, and I'm delighted to be here today. Aloha. I'm from Hawaii, as you can see, and what I hope to do today is spend just a bit of time talking about navigating currents and choices, reflections on women in geography and sustainability science. I was going to give recognition to 2 women firsts, which I'm going to do, but I want to do it to a third because it turns out that Paulette Hazier, the Chief of Geography and Map Division, is also the first woman to hold that position. But the 2 individuals who I wanted to recognize and acknowledge as first are Carla Hayden, who is the 14th Librarian of Congress, sworn in 2016. She's the first woman and the first African American to be in that position. She's had a very distinguished career as a university professor and librarian, and she's receiving the Association of American Geographers Atlas Award, the highest award that the AAG gives. It's only given every other year. And it's awarded to international leaders who advance world understanding in exceptional ways. And she's receiving it for being an outspoken advocate for librarian as activist, championing equal access to libraries and information. And the second person I wanted to point out as a first is a friend of mine, Rita Colwell, who has been named the honorary AAG geographer for this year. She's a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her work is focused on health and water. She's published over 750 articles, and Rita was the first woman director of the National Science Foundation. And Rita will tell you, and she has written, that even when she was director of the National Science Foundation, she would go to a meeting with a group of largely men, make a series of comments that were ignored, and a man would then make the same things, and they were brilliantly received. So, and for those of you who are interested in trivia, the AAG did pretty well. We had our first female president in 1921, Ellen Churchill Semple. But we can't congratulate ourselves too much because we had to wait another 60 years to have a female president of the AAG, and that was in 1984, and it was Risa. Excuse me. You don't have to worry, I'm not going to tell you my life story, but I did want to drop a few institutional anchors in the water to help shape the rest of my discussion. The first photo up there on the left is the Campanile at the University of California, Berkeley. I did all my undergraduate and graduate work there. I don't recommend that. I think it's good to get to know different institutions, but that is what I did. When I returned to graduate school in 1972 in the geography department, it was definitely a male bastion. There was only one female faculty member and only for a few years, and that was Risa. And I was only one of 2 women in the program who had a child. During that time, I got an interdisciplinary degree in health and medical sciences, which shaped my PhD dissertation research and the rest of my career. It also introduced me to interdisciplinary perspectives and user-based science. The second picture up there actually did have an anchor. That's a 32-foot sailboat that my former husband and I built and sailed across the Pacific while I did my dissertation on ciguatera fish poisoning, a marine biotoxin. I think this is really what gives me my credentials in the Society for Women Geographers. I was also totally crazy, but it was a wonderful way to see the Pacific, and I have spent most of my professional life working on Pacific Island issues. The third image up there is the logo of the Pacific Science Association, a non-governmental interdisciplinary science organization that was founded in 1920. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I've been involved with PSA since 1976 when I attended a meeting as a graduate student, and it also had a lot of great influence on my life. I joined the faculty at the University of Hawaii in geography in 1981. I was the only woman on that faculty for 8 years out of 15 faculty members. I found mentors outside of geography, was involved in things like founding the Women's Faculty Caucus and advocating for gender pay equity, and then administering that when I was Associate Dean at UH. And in 2002, I joined the EastWest Center as the Director of Research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that because Mary actually asked me to talk a little about the EastWest Center. But it's been a very interesting professional experience. But I bought this card about 25 years ago and framed it, and you can read it as well as I. I didn't wonder every day, but there were days I really wondered where I was, but be that as it may. Kat, having worked very hard to get somewhere now, wondering where it is she really got. So I have 4 parts to my talk. I'm going to talk very briefly about all of them: geography and sustainability science, gender and climate change adaptation, which is based on some work I have done, women in science in Asia and the Pacific, and then the EastWest Center focusing on some spectacular EastWest Center women. When I first started thinking about this talk, I reflected, and it was really from personal observation, that many of the influential individuals involved in international endeavors related to environment and development, scientific assessments, global change research programs, were geographers, mostly not women. However, when I delved, and this is a contemporary definition of sustainability science, when I delved into the literature by professional geographers, the experts in the field, the view is probably, or the dominant view, is that geographers have not played a large enough role, either women or men. And I think that's debatable, and it's an interesting set of questions. And for those interested, I definitely suggest reading this recent article in Dialogues in Human Geography by Diana Liverman, who was one of the first chairs of the National Academy of Science Committee on Human Dimensions of Global Change, and she explores geographers' engagement with sustainable development agendas. And she argues that geographers are well positioned to contribute to the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda, and that we can be partners and critics in measuring the goals, that we are familiar with problems of data aggregation, as well as the hidden geographies of suffering. Critical GIS scholars understand the choice of variables, scales, indices, and visuals, and how this impacts what is prioritized, invisible, and biased. And we can use the power of spatial analysis to inform debates about social and environmental justice. Liverman, who has contributed greatly to geography overall, but certainly to climate change science as well, notes that geographers have played significant roles in the elaboration of climate goals and policies, especially highlighting the importance of vulnerability and adaptation, and of introducing critical perspectives on gender, race, and scale. Moving to my second theme on gender and climate change adaptation, and this is a bit of a soapbox issue for me, but persistent in both climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and I would argue that we should be looking at those together, and more generally, sustainable development. Discussions have been characterized by women as primarily poor, vulnerable victims in the global South. This has persisted despite the fact that there have been significant attempts to change this view for over 2 decades. It's a view that disempowers women and diminishes their role in decision-making. And these are just a few, what you're seeing on the screen now are just a few of the examples of publications that are focusing on empowering women in these situations, not seeing them as vulnerable. To take an example from IPCC reports, the 2 most recent vulnerability and assessment reports were in 2007 and 2014. And the 2007 report was 1,000 pages long, and there were 5 references to either gender or women. 4 of those were referring to vulnerable victims in the South. In the 2014 report, it was somewhat better, and there was actually a very small cross-cutting chapter on gender, but it referred to the chapters on poverty and vulnerability. So the same thing persisted. But to be fair, the cross-cutting volume also suggests that there are significant new findings on how climate change is differentiated by gender, as well as how climate change contributes to perpetuating gender inequities. Women and children are vulnerable. They have different vulnerabilities to climate change, as well as different adaptive capacities. Gender, along with age, wealth, class, and disability, do interact to shape how women and children experience these events. However, women are incredible agents of change, and it's been shown time and time again to be highly resilient. They play very important family and community roles with respect to sustainable development. Their understanding of social networks and community resources, as well as their life experiences, have much to contribute to adaptation and sustainable development. With respect to disasters, women's community groups are very often involved in the crisis period, but women are typically not the key decision makers, nor are they the prime recipients of assistance. However, if adaptation interventions are targeted at women, and for example, providing credit or specialized training or appropriate technologies, the interventions can be very important tools for gender empowerment and community resilience. Moving on to my third theme, rapidly. That is very much younger me, opening the 7th Pacific Science Congress in Honolulu in 1991. The theme was Towards the Pacific Century, the Challenge of Change. It was a meeting with about 1,500 participants, which was relatively large at that time. As far as I know, it was the first of the Pacific Science meetings to have a symposium on women in development, and we also established the Human Resources for the Future Working Group, which looks at women in science and other represented groups in science as well. 4 years later, we were able to secure NSF funding for a very significant series of sessions on gender science and technology in the Pacific in Beijing. And 3 months later, a number of us returned to Beijing to participate in the Women's Science and Technology sessions at the NGO Forum associated with the World Conference on Women. There's the opening ceremony. We had a Once and Future Action Network that was on telecommunication technology. And the final picture are some women from Papua New Guinea who were selling their handicrafts to help pay for their participation in the meeting. It was really quite exciting. 2 years later, at a smaller meeting at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, we had a series of sessions on indigenous knowledge to new information technologies. There was significant grassroots participation in that meeting. We had Fiji is not that large, but we had hundreds of school children coming through to see the exhibits and interact with the scientists. And there are 2 PhD candidates, one from what was then Western Samoa, Asanati Leaky on the right of the screen, who is now teaching at the University of the South Pacific, and the other Saele, who is teaching at one of the campuses of the University of Hawaii on Oahu. I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot of the overview of science, women in science in Asia and the Pacific. If you're interested in this, the 2016 World Science Report, produced by UNESCO, has a chapter. It's chapter 3, written by Sophia Heyer, is the gender gap narrowing in science and engineering. Sophia is the founding executive director of Women in Global Science and Technology. She's a leader in the field, and I've had the opportunity of working with her quite closely. We all know there's a leaky pipeline. This exists everywhere. It's worse in some places than others. At the bachelor's and master's degree, it's often parity in enrollment in science courses, science and technology courses, but a big fall off at the PhD and female researcher level. This is, excuse me, from that report by UNESCO, and there's significant differences in women's participation in science across the globe. It's highest in Latin America and the Caribbean, reaching up to 55% in some of the countries, and actually in Bolivia at 63%. It's also relatively high in Eastern Europe, and part of the rationale, not the rationale for it, part of the explanation for this is the investment that Soviet governments put in education and educating women. It's low in sub-Saharan Africa, which is not surprising, about 30%. It's only 33% in the EU. There are data comparability issues. We really don't have the same data for the United States, but it's probably around 35% in the US. And of course, in all these cases, it's often weighted toward the life sciences and medical sciences, not engineering or computer science. There's excuse me, I'm gonna get some water. Substantial differences within Asia. Apologies. The rates in South Asia are lowest, 17% overall. Southeast Asia fares much better. In Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, it's almost parity. Indonesia and Singapore, 30%, Cambodia, 20%. It's low in China. Again, their data issues, it's about 35% in China. The two lowest rates are in Korea, where it's 18%, and Japan, 15%. And that's despite significant efforts on the part of the Japanese government and Abenomics to get more women involved. And one of the reasons Korea and Japan and China are concerned is because they also have very low fertility rates. And so the human resource base for science is threatened if we don't use all of human potential to address the challenges of sustainability. It's also very interesting to look at the membership in National Academies of Science. Overall, globally, it's 12%. In the US, it's 13%. Women are higher in the governance of these bodies, but the overall percentages are low. And I had the opportunity not too long ago to be having lunch with the president of one of the East Asian Academies of Science and a couple of other academicians. And I asked him, I said, I know you can have 150 members of your academy. You told me there are 136 right now. Can you tell me how many women there are? And he thought for a little while, and he said 2, but one's a home economist. So, I mean, we're still hearing the same thing that Mary was talking about. It's really quite astounding. Why is this the case? I certainly don't have time to go into all this in any detail, but it's perceptions about women in science, culture, traditional role of women, family expectations. Another friend of mine from East Asia, when her mother learned that she was given a full ride to get her doctorate at Harvard, burst into tears and said, I'm never going to have grandchildren. So the family plays an important role in this in East Asia. Well, everywhere, but there as well. Barriers to education, poverty plays a role. The glass ceiling we all know about, as well as the sticky floors. Cultural expectations of the workplace, and even the structure of the workforce. In particular in Korea and Japan, once you leave a position for maternity or other family reasons or other reasons, it's very hard to get back on track. And you may get a part-time position, you may get temporary positions, but that's part of the stories too. And they both have attitudinal and practical aspects. And I'm going to conclude with a quote from that chapter I was referring to by Sophia. Gender equality is more than a question of justice or equity. Countries, businesses, and institutions which create an enabling environment for women increase their innovative capacity and competitiveness. The scientific endeavor benefits from the creativity and vibrancy of the interaction and different perspectives and expertise. Gender equality will encourage new solutions and expand the scope of research. This should be considered a priority for all if the global community is serious about reaching the next set of development goals. And we all know that diversity in decision-making results in richer decisions. So my final few slides are about the EastWest Center. We're based on the campus of the University of Hawaii, although we're not part of the University of Hawaii. It was founded in 1960 by an act of Congress to enhance the relationship between the peoples of the US and Asia Pacific. And we get about half of our funding from the federal government. We have to come and beg every year for our congressional appropriation. But increasingly, we're sort of weaning ourselves off for some obvious reasons of dependence on the federal government. We have a small office here in DC on L Street. And the point of the center is bringing people together for cooperative study, research, and dialogue to exchange views, build experience, and develop policy options. We do that through research, funding students at the University of Hawaii, education, and professional development. Focusing on leadership, and we have a strong engagement with the media and helping train the media in reporting in the region. While we are an Asia-Pacific focused organization, we are also the incubator for things that have happened in Hawaii, like the Hawaii International Film Festival, which is the biggest Asia-Pacific film festival, and also the Polynesian Voyaging Society, which I'm going to speak to at the end of my talk. I only have time to talk about one project at the center. It's a research project that's related to sustainability science. And I'm going to talk about 3 outstanding women who have gone through the center and are really major change agents. The project I'm going to talk about is the Pacific Risa. It's one of 10 regional integrated science and assessments for climate change funded by NOAA across the United States. And we're in the 4th year of our second 5-year tranche of money in this project, and we're quite convinced we're going to get funded again. I hope that's true. All Risa projects are interdisciplinary. They focus on the co-production of knowledge, continued dialogue between researchers and end users, sustained relationships, and framed in decision-relevant contexts. And this is our Pacific Risa. It's funded by NOAA through the EastWest Center. We fund researchers at the University of Hawaii, at the University of Guam. We work with USGS, the National Weather Service, and a number of other organizations. The objectives are to conduct place-based assessment of risk and vulnerability for Pacific Islands, this is for Hawaii and the American Insular jurisdictions in the Pacific, support the implementation of adaptation strategies for Pacific Island communities, evaluate adaptation plans and policymaking in the region, and integrate technical information and policy outcomes. We've just received in the last month another grant in addition to this to look at climate change and adaptation and health from the Marshall Islands and other American Pacific islands. The PI for this grant, Dr. Victoria Keener, was one of the co-authors of the lead authors of the Islands chapter for the 4th National Climate Assessment that was released a couple months ago. This is the Pacific Risa team, the larger team, not only our core team at the EastWest Center, but other researchers from both Hawaii and other parts of the Pacific, highly interdisciplinary, as you can see, hydrology, climatology, atmospheric physics, geography, which I'm going to return to, resources law, public policy, psychology, and public health. This is our core team. You see the PI there, Dr. Victoria Keener on the left with the 2 senators from Hawaii, Mazie Hirona and Brian Schatz. Vicki herself is an engineer, hydraulic engineer. But in then the other picture, you will see Vicki, and to her right is Dr. Laura Brewington from the University of North Carolina, who's a geographer, and on the far left is Krista Jasper, our communications specialist, who has her master's in geography from the University of Hawaii. And just this month, we hired Dr. Wendy Miles to come on board as the program manager. She's also a geographer, and we're actually bringing a male on board, another geographer, Daniel Irvin. So it's a heavily geographic core team, and it's fantastic to work with. So now, I have some of these flyers. We put this flyer together at the EastWest Center about 9 or 10 months ago to bring together activities in all parts of the center that were focused on gender, and it was associated with a meeting that we were holding. But I have some copies of this. It's also available on as a PDF on the EastWest Center website. So now I'm going to talk about 3 wonderful women who are real change makers. In terms of women's rights, this is Arfa Zira. She's a good friend of mine. She was a graduate degree fellow in the 1960s from Pakistan. She got her PhD in history and taught at several universities in Pakistan. She was head of the Pakistan National Commission on the Status of Women and a key player in the passage of the 2006 Women's Protection Act. She was described by UNIFEM colleagues, what was then UNIFEM, as not only the conscience of women, but the conscience of government and civil society in Pakistan. Really an incredible person. She looks kind of stern in that left-hand picture, which was some kind of professional headshot, but she's absolutely hysterical. And I've had the opportunity of being in Pakistan with her, and she's amazing. Then on to the diplomat, Amanda Ellis. She was a degree fellow in the 1970s. She's an economist. She was in the private sector, a senior executive with Westpac Bank in Australia. She worked as a gender advisor at the World Bank. She returned to New Zealand, her native country, and joined the Foreign Service. She was the first female head of New Zealand aid programs, and she was the New Zealand head of mission and ambassador to the UN in Geneva and Francophone Africa. She was seconded to the EastWest Center for 2 years as a special assistant to the EastWest Center president, and she's just accepted a position as the director for Asia Pacific of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute on Sustainability Science at Arizona State, which is a quite amazing institute. What they're doing in sustainability at Arizona State is really exciting. And she's also president of the EastWest Center Alumni Association. She's actually based in Hawaii, and we're working on several projects closely together. And the last person I wanted to talk to you about is Linda Furuto. She was actually in one of our 9-month leadership programs in 2006 and 2007. She's shown on the right there with the Polynesian Voyaging Society president, Nainoa Thompson, and she is one of the female navigators of the voyaging canoe Hokulea, which recently made a round-the-world voyage. which I'm going to speak to in a moment. She's an associate professor of education at the University of Hawaii. She's what we call a local girl. She was raised in rural Oahu, and she was totally scared of mathematics. But using the knowledge that she developed through becoming a traditional navigator and learning from nature based on indigenous knowledge, she created the field of ethnomathematics. And that's basically learning from nature, and she's internationally known for this. We have a certificate in ethnomathematics at the University of Hawaii School of Education, and she just spent her sabbatical at Columbia and Stanford, so she's really an amazing woman. She said of the program that she attended at the EastWest Center, "The extraordinary experience provided me the opportunity to interact with local and global organizations and communities and places, and these relationships have helped me navigate the past 10 years of my life." There's obviously a navigating theme in this talk. So what's next? Well, I'm speaking here to the younger among you, I think, but you are the key to the future. Fill your toolkit with everything you can, from GI science to critical theory. Commit to what matters to you. Be open to challenge and change. Serendipity will play a part in what your career holds, so be open to that as well. And there are going to be work-life balance challenges, not only for women, but for men. That's the reality of life. And those cherry blossoms were not here. Those were in Tokyo a couple of years ago. I haven't gotten down to see them here yet. Well, this is the Hokulea, which was originally built in 1976. It's made 12 voyages and traveled 150,000 miles, using only sails and traditional navigation, no sextant, nothing, just the stars and the knowledge of the navigators. In 2017, it completed a 47,000-mile voyage around the world of stewardship and sustainability. The name of the voyage was Malama Honua, literally caring for the earth. And you can see the map of the voyage on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side was the Hokulea's landfall in Apia, Samoa in 2014, and it was there to join the UN Small Island Developing States meeting. And Ban Ki-moon, who was Secretary General of the UN at that time, went out sailing on the Hokulea. I've not sailed on her, I sailed on her sister ship. So with that, I close my talk, and I thank everyone for their interest. Thank you.
So the next person that I want to introduce is Kavita Pandit. I always told her, I said, I hope I say your name correctly. I first saw this particular presentation, which she has changed for this conference in general, at the National Council for Geographic Education conference up in Quebec. And I thought she would be a fantastic addition in talking about what she's doing today in trends in faculty careers and their implication for women geographers. So with that, I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Mary, for this invitation, and I've really enjoyed the speakers this morning and learned so much about Society of Women Geographers and a little bit of the history, so thank you for this invitation. At today's, in the next 25 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is speak to two questions, or address two questions. One is, how have the jobs and careers of faculty changed over the 20, 25, 30-year span? Certainly since I came out of grad school, there's been a tremendous change, and share a little bit of what I've observed. And then speak to what does it mean in how we mentor our young geographers, students, as well as colleagues in our department. And much of this certainly has come from my observations over the last 4 or 5 years in my current role at Georgia State University. So when I graduated with a PhD in the late 80s, The best metaphor I can think of for faculty careers is this. There was this sort of straight highway, which was, if you were on the tenure track, this was where you were supposed to be. Everybody went along that main highway. Occasionally, though, you may not, there may be, everything doesn't line up so perfectly, and then you kind of have this little side road you have to take, which, is a temporary job, adjunct, visiting. A number of different terminologies were used for that. So the idea was, if you're doing things right and everything lines up, you're going to be on that tenure track. If not, well, okay, you have to settle for this temporary job, but hopefully, in a year, maybe 2 at the most, you'll be back on the highway. There'll be an on-ramp further down, and you'll be back. And that was pretty much how we viewed our academic career. If you look back at this period between 1980 and 1993, around the time I got into the profession as a faculty member, much of my observations, personal observations, were captured by this article by Phil Suckling that came out around this time, in which he examined the jobs in geography listings that put out by the American Association of Geographers each year, and analyzed the jobs that were advertised over this time period. One was his methodology. He took a very simple approach. He says, the jobs fall into 2 categories, tenure track, and temporary, and that the majority of the jobs are tenure track during this time. So very much what my personal experience was, and the metaphor I created for myself, was supported by this article that came out in 1994 in the Professional Geographer. So fast forward to now, and what I did was I went through the listings and jobs in geography, did a very quick survey. I have not done this, replicated his methodology, but looked over the 5-year period from 2013 to 2017. And certainly the vast majority of the positions were tenure track still, so either assistant, associate, full professor. And there was its share of temporary positions, and they came under different names. However, they advertised it: visiting, term assistant professor, adjunct. There were a range of different terms used for this. But then you see a whole set of positions that were unknown to me when I got out of grad school, and that is positions that are not tenure track, yet they're not temporary either. And here I refer to them as full-time, non-tenure track positions. And they have, again, a whole set of different titles and names, from lecturers or clinical professors, research faculty, you name it, there's a whole range of names. So this was something that was clearly new in the last 25 or 30 years, where this group is really growing. In looking at the distribution of these faculty positions in 2018 across these 3 categories, the vast majority of positions are certainly tenure track. 3/4 of the positions are tenured or tenure track positions. About 16%, very similar to what we saw 25 years ago in Phil Suckling's study. About 16% are temporary positions. But then you see this new slice of the pie in 2018 was about 11%, 11.5%. That are these non-tenure track full-time positions that, again, were not on my radar 30 years ago, or anyone's radar. And looking at the gender breakdown around this time, and not a drastic difference, but this shouldn't surprise us that, in general, women have a slightly smaller share of the pie in terms of tenure track positions. Smaller share of them are in tenure track positions, and about 1/3 of them are either in temporary positions or in the full-time non-tenure track positions. You know, a little bit of difference, but it is generally following the same pathway. There's one caveat I do have to say about the data here, and that is that the data that are reported here are drawn from the AAG Guide to Geography Programs. It's a sort of thick book that they put out each year now online. And these data pertain to faculty that are in geography programs that report their data. So it certainly underreports, it does not capture faculty that are not in geography programs, that may be in general social science departments or environmental sciences program, where they're one of an interdisciplinary mix of faculty. Certainly faculty in two-year institutions or smaller tech colleges, the geographers working there would not be captured here. So that's just something to keep in mind. So stepping away from geography to see how close or how similar is it to national trends. I looked at, I pulled out IPED's data, which reports all faculty positions, and I restricted it to public institutions because, clearly geography is more present at public institutions currently, or the vast majority of geographers currently do work at public institutions. And if you look at the trend for research universities from 1993 to 2013, you see a trend that most of us kind of know is going on, but it's clearly evident that the smaller and smaller share of the total faculty is tenured or tenure track. There's definitely a shrinking share of the pie and a growing share of the pie for these temporary positions, temporary faculty positions, and these full-time non-tenure track positions. It shouldn't be a surprise, but here it is in color. And if you look at two-year institutions, community colleges or two-year colleges, public institutions again, the trend is the same, but you see a very different allocation of the faculty positions. In many of two-year colleges, public colleges, there's a relatively small share, that too shrinking, of tenured and tenure track, and the bulk of the persons they hire fall in the temporary or non-tenure track categories. It is pretty similar if you look at private research universities and private two-year institutions. There really is a very similar trend. And just to accentuate the same point, it is not as if tenured or tenure track faculty positions are shrinking. They're just growing at a very slow rate. They are growing. All faculty numbers are growing. Number of institutions is growing. But tenured and tenure track faculty are growing at the smallest rate. Full-time, non-tenure track at this pretty, group that we didn't even know of is now growing quite rapidly. And certainly the part-time or temporary faculty are growing at the fastest rates. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about these, because clearly our very first reaction as faculty, as women academics, is like, oh my gosh, how terrible that the non-tenure track positions, tenure track positions are shrinking. And it is, we sort of think about non-tenure track positions as inferior, less attractive, they're like second choice positions. But here's where we see something happening that perhaps may be different from what meets the eye. This group of fast-growing faculty category, full-time non-tenure track faculty that I wasn't aware of when I came out of grad school, really are now capturing very specialized faculty roles. So these faculty, instead of having a workload that touches on teaching, research, and service, they tend to specialize in one category or the other. So we see full-time non-tenure track faculty that are in very teaching-oriented positions. They may be in lecturers, we see sometimes clinical faculty doing a different kind of a teaching, instructors. Many non-tenure track positions are research focused. These are not postdocs, nor are they tenured research professors that don't do teaching anymore. These are faculty positions that from the get-go are advertised as research-only positions. There's a lot of mentoring of research students, grads, running labs, running projects, applying for grants, all of the above, but it is 100% research, doesn't carry tenure. And you see, similarly, service-focused positions where faculty may be running labs. In my previous job, where I headed up international education, I had 3 faculty who were full-time service. They were academic professionals, and they supervised and ran my university's international centers. We had 3 centers in 3 different countries, and they did a little bit of teaching, but they were supervising the students and the facilities. So it was very much a faculty position. And some universities have started calling this even specialized faculty, but it is not. It is certainly non-tenure track. And what is really important to know is more and more universities are now creating promotion tracks for their full-time non-tenure track faculty. At University of Georgia, I've got a little tape, at Georgia State where I am, you see some of the ranks we use. So if you start off as a lecturer, you can, after 5 years, move to a senior lecturer and then to a principal senior. There's a clinical assistant associate full. These are very well-defined career pathways. And contrary to what our perception might be of non-tenure track faculty, I'll give you just a couple of instances. There's one non-tenure track full-time principal senior lecturer who until recently was serving as associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, supervising the, really in the student side of things, student complaints, student programs, curriculum, and so forth. Another associate clinical faculty member in our public policy school is currently participating in the very large Bill Gates grant that the university has related to student success. So she is developing programs and supervising others in how we can change how we teach, flipped classrooms, hybrid classes, active-based learning, and so forth. But these are positions of responsibilities. We have non-tenure track full-time faculty members serving on our executive committee of the university senate. So it's a very different perception than what we may have had in the past of non-tenure track faculty. Likewise, when you think of part-time faculty, I mean, the top left picture is sort of our adjunct, the stereotypical view we have of adjunct faculty, overwhelmed with teaching. And this is, I wish I could say this is no longer true. It very much is the case in some disciplines, particularly in the humanities. A very large share of faculty are in these low-paying, course-by-course, sort of remunerated positions that really can be quite exhausting and almost exploitative. Yet, and geography has its, has faculty in this category as well. At the same time, part-time faculty growth has been as much due to rise in individuals who have positions in corporate America. They may be working for nonprofits, may be working for other government agencies, and want to teach an evening class or participate in some way to advise students. And they can come in as professors of practice or experts in residence. You see artists that come for short periods of time to advise art students or music students. So there's a range of part-time positions that may not fit our perception of what part-time positions are. And here too, I'm seeing, and I have to say, albeit anecdotally now, in my position as I see hiring packages come over my desk, that I am seeing a trend whereby faculty that start in adjunct teaching or part-time teaching for a year or 2 or 3, there's an increasing tendency where they move into full-time non-tenure track positions. These faculty, in the past, it was very unlikely that they could get tenure track positions, because if you're in a very heavy, teaching-heavy position, chances are that you don't have time to keep up with your research and it would not be competitive for a research-type tenure track position. However, those that are doing teaching and doing well and they're advising well find themselves increasingly competitive for these specialized faculty lines. And I've seen these coming in, and it's not just, I mean, you see even, we had a faculty member from the Centers for Disease Control, which is up the street from my university, who was coming in as a visiting professor of practice, had a full-time job and did a part-time teaching at Georgia State. And over time, she said, I really love academia. And she then moved in. So you see much different kinds of patterns emerging today. So if the metaphor I used then for faculty careers was a picture on the left, the best metaphor I can think of today would be something like this. It's where you have a whole range of different faculty types. You come in at different points, you may exit, you may move off, come back in. And this is the image of what faculty careers today look like. Yet many of us still think of it as the picture on the left. And this takes me to the career mentoring part of my talk, which is, when I thought of how I was mentored so my professor certainly encouraged me, says, you're doing good research, you must get a job at a PhD granting institution, get a tenure track job. That's where I want you to go. And, you, especially as you hear stories of how women were not encouraged in the past, certainly that was so appreciative. How wonderful that this professor is really kind of guiding me along in this way. Well, if you turn to what career mentoring is today, guess what? Here's a major professor still saying, of course you must aim for a tenure track position in a major university. More and more we see people like me who are mentoring us who say, that's how I did it. That's what my major professor told me. That's what I'm going to tell you and really hope the best for you. And it's most likely this is what your advisee is thinking. And your students now, they have a better feel for what's going on than the faculty may have. So as mentors, what I say is we owe it to our students and to ourselves to be very aware of what the trends in higher education are. Be fairly once we are knowledgeable, be transparent about what the statistics are out there for students. I mean, your student may be a top-class researcher. She may want a tenure-track position. Go for it. Push your advisor. I see a lot of graduate students who may say, I really want to do a teaching job, do I? But then if I get a tenure-track position, I'm going to have to do research, and that's going to be tough, or I want to be able to, pay time to my family and then come back in, and we're saying, you must go to a research tenure-track position. And there may be other options that may fit them better and not feel under the pressure to please you. And there are ways in which we can support them, advise them, make them aware, prepare them. I mean, involve them in some of the curricular work that's going on. Let them know what compliance functions go on in the university. Increasingly today, a lot of what our non-tenure track faculty are doing is helping students with their graduation rates, success rates, making them aware of what this undergraduate student debt problem is. And this is how we will be preparing them for a much bigger, wider set of career choices. And not to forget the faculty that are in our departments, for those of you who are academics. This is not unusual. I mean, there's the adjunct professor I think, who might be asking, gosh, should I even be here? I wasn't invited. Now they're about to take a vote. Do I vote? Do I not? If I speak up, will I be? And this should not happen, especially if you see how academia is changing. So how we mentor, support all faculty is going to reflect well on us and our department. It's also the language we use. I mean, very often, I don't like the term non-tenure track faculty because it says what we are not. And I see more and more universities actually coming up. One university, I think it was Virginia Tech, now uses collegiate faculty to speak to non-tenure track full-time faculty. Others use specialized faculty. We've got to change our language and that kind of implied caste system that we so automatically fall into without thinking, and really think of how we support all our faculty, because they may be hiring you tomorrow. And I'll stop my talk there and really aspire for success for all our faculty in this new environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandit. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Susan Shaw. Dr. Shaw is an SWG member, and as Mary mentioned earlier this morning, she is a gold medal recipient for her pioneering research documenting the harmful impacts of man-made chemicals on marine life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shaw.
Thank you for inviting me, and Mary, thank you, and Molly, thank you for the brief but wonderful introduction. I want to tell you some stories today about my adventures in science and my struggles, really. And but before I do that, I'd like to take us to the stories about some women that have gone before. And let me just see if I can, is this, yeah, this is working. Okay. All these women that went before us, and there are many of the women sitting in this room who are so outstanding, and I wish that I knew you all. But many of the women who've gone before have had a struggle. Women in science, being a woman in science is a struggle. And in previous generations, it was much harder. I have put these women into categories, but they're all important and they have all shown us the way. In 1903, Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize in physics, and then in 1911 in chemistry. This is unbelievable that a woman would win 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields. And then her daughter carried on her work and took a Nobel in chemistry in 1935. And these women, I put in a group, hidden figures. Although they did win the prize, they have international recognition, but in our history, in our minds, they are left behind without probably the kind of recognition that women can get today. Now, these are 2 more women who have won the Nobel in chemistry. One is Dorothy Hodgkin, 1964, and Ada Yonath, 2009. There are only 5 women who have won the Nobel Prize in chemistry out of 175 prizes that have been given. There are some women that were truly overlooked. The story of Rosalind Franklin, the chemist who discovered the X-ray photo method as a key to looking into DNA. The DNA helix structure, of course, was overlooked and not acknowledged in the papers. Watson and Crick took the Nobel Prize. Jocelyn Bell similarly discovered the first radio pulsars in '67, and her supervisor, who was her co-worker, took the prize. These women were definitely overlooked. The first woman in space was Dr. Sally Ride, and she was quite a scientist. And I think, although her accomplishment was tremendous, we have, the memory kind of fades about these women. And then, I don't know if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, but it took a book to bring these women out of obscurity. Particularly, I would talk about Katherine Johnson, who by hand computed the trajectory for John Glenn's flights into orbit in the early 60s. And she's a math genius. She graduated from college at 18. She was a prodigy. And if you've seen that movie, it's an ocean of men in white coats, and these three women who are pretty much not allowed to come into the room, have to drink coffee from a different urn, have to run a mile to go to the bathroom. And these women were instrumental in our whole manned space flight program. So thankfully, 57 years later, Margot Shetterly wrote this book, Hidden Figures, and brought them to light. And the movie it takes some license, I agree with that, but it's definitely worth seeing. You have to realize these women are achieving in Virginia in the Jim Crow South. So you have, there's racism in addition to sexism, in addition to the way women were viewed at that time as belonging in the home. These women are game changers. They have broken the mold. They will stay in our memory forever. And Frances Arnold is the 5th woman to win the Chemistry Nobel Prize last year. She says, if you're going to change the world, you've got to be fearless. Well, no one is actually fearless. It takes, what she's talking about is guts. It takes grit and guts if you're a woman in science. These women are the game changers in my world. Amelia Earhart, who was so determined to fly, she said, I want to do it because I want to do it. Women like men should try to do the impossible, and then when they fail, their failure should be a challenge to others. She's a lot of grit and guts in this woman, and she made the first, transatlantic flight, 1928, and she was our first gold medal awardee, I think, of the SWG. She said, courage is the price that life exacts for granting peace. I think that's talking about peace within the person who is driven to go beyond. So this is her standing in front of her Electra, Lockheed, and her final flight, as we all know, in 1937. Jane Goodall is another SWG gold medalist. She will always be in our world for her work in primatology, breaking the boundary of language that is shared between animals and people, and her work as a UN messenger of peace. She says, here we are, the most clever species to have ever lived. So how is it we can destroy the only planet we have? So you see, as we go forward, women are starting to put their arms around the world and become part of a global mission. People said, Jane, forget about this nonsense with Africa, dream about things you can achieve. Well, she didn't forget, and we're all the better for it. Sylvia Earle, probably less well known, but for me, she's such a heroine. She pioneered oceanography. She was the first female scientist, chief scientist of NOAA, and has won many, many awards, including the TED Prize. She says, we must protect our oceans as if our lives depend on it, because they do. And one more wonderful woman is Rachel Carson, who probably is my biggest role model in my life, who worked on environmental challenges. She credited with starting the modern environmental movement. As you know, wrote Silent Spring in '62, which led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first really critical look at DDT. She says, the most alarming of all man's assault upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers, and sea with dangerous and even lethal materials. And we will talk about her later. In the trenches, I think, are people like myself who are carrying the torch and following in the footsteps of these giants. Linda Birnbaum is a colleague of mine, known her for 20 years. She's a leading figure in government science in this country. She's the director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. So she has made very almost daring statements in light of her professional position, and she has looked at the economic consequences of childhood exposure to toxic chemicals, and also for the rest of us. Gerda Keller is interesting. She's revolutionary. She has challenged the belief that the dinosaurs, the last extinction, was caused by a single asteroid that hit the planet. And she's gone against the paradigm that has been in place for decades. And the reception to her is almost like the reception to Galileo when he decided to announce that, the Earth was rotating around the sun. And they put him away for 30 years on house arrest. And the response to Gerda Keller is very, very, very similar with this Alvarez theory and all the proponents of it. We're going to have her speak at my institute this summer. She is quite a wonderful person, I would say a contrarian at heart. We vastly overestimate the damage to the environment and life that this single asteroid's impact had. Her theory is about a series of ongoing volcanoes in regions around India that were already causing extinction before the asteroid hit. So I think you will be hearing more about Gerda Keller. And then two people in the trenches with me are this wildlife toxicologist who's senior scientist at the Swedish Museum of Natural History, Anna Roos, who does forensics on all kinds of wildlife, like otters, who discovered that otters were declining in Sweden, and she tied that to toxic chemicals, and now they come back. Maria Westerbos is a dynamite person who has founded the Plastic Soup Foundation and the Plastic Health Coalition, and she's driving a revolution in the battle against plastic pollution today. And here I am, I put myself in here. I've been in the trenches, in the battle lines on chemicals, oil spills, plastics, and climate change for 30 years. And I think we are looking at a whole new future ahead of us. We are just not there. And we're in a big backlash right now where there's a war on science, but the replacement of fossil fuels with clean energy is going to revolutionize our lives. It's an urgent priority that I'm working on. Now, before we get to those stories, I want to talk about tobacco because that's what the game is all about in environmental science. It's a game that must be won. It's a tough battle against powerful industries, powerful lobbies, lots of money, our economic structure that's founded on fossil fuel, the fossil fuel economy that we're in, and the consequences of that. Tobacco starts advertising in the 40s and ongoing and getting doctors to talk on TV about and in print about the health benefits of smoking. And I know that my mother was very, very impressed by this, and she had a Vogue magazine from 1937 that had these glamorous women posing in their jodhpurs, smoking, Camel and unfiltered, and I mean it was so glamorous. And also the ad on the Vogue magazine said, "Smoke 3 times a day because it helps your digestion." So Mother was sure to do that. And then they started sponsoring TV shows. This is Jack Webb, the Dragnet. Celebrities, Hollywood stars smoked. Here you have Burton and Taylor lighting up. And the Marlboro Men, the icons of masculinity and athleticism and the ranch and all that stuff. So warnings, the warning actually came out 65 from the Surgeon General and it didn't actually go on the packages 100% until about 1970. But here's the warning, and starts a public campaign because the science has now made the link, and people have started dying. All the Marlboro Men actually died of lung cancer, except one, I think. And millions of other people, they started taking their cases to court. And here's what happened. This is a playbook for all the powerful industries that are resisting being tampered with. And it's really about profit, but it's denial that there's a connection. And this is like in the science. Delay in court, and deception, disinformation campaigns, and use of advertising. So here is something very insidious, in my opinion, the ads that linked smoking with women's freedom and women's athleticism in sports, the Virginia Slims campaign that was in the 70s. And you have to realize now, Ms. Magazine is coming out, women are going through a change, they're becoming liberated. And so this brilliant ad agency figured out a way to capitalize on that. And they actually did sponsor into the 90s this, not on TV, however. Even Never to Lova, this is 94, sponsored by Virginia Slims. So there was an outcry about this, of course. And here's the last ad. Here's some of the ads that you'll remember, all the Frank Sinatra. And then, really distorting science by saying science and educators and doctors smoke X brand. And then this is horrible, little child buying a carton for his parents. Okay, and then the teenage campaign with this guy, Camel. And so the ads were banned from TV in 1970, and last one was on Johnny Carson Tonight Show. And you see here, this is where the science wins, but it took a long time. When the warning came out in the 60s, people didn't actually stop smoking. They stopped smoking more like in the 70s, it starts to come down. And then you see it comes down further and further. But it's interesting that when the ads went off of TV and then they were moved from print as well, they could stop doing this insane advertising of something that was dangerous. Then that's when the public perception changed. And then the counter campaign showed, people with lungs that were quite black and things like that. So television really has shaped public opinion. After the war, petrochemicals and plastics ramped up, and we believed in living better with chemistry as a motto. We started spraying DDT in the late 40s, remember the children following the DDT trucks. DDT was a miracle of modern science. And here comes Rachel Carson, who messed it all up. She wrote this book, Silent Spring, that questioned for the first time this whole post-war, promotion of toxic chemicals. And the impact of that has just been tremendous. She said, the most alarming of all man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers, and sea with dangerous and even lethal materials. And it calls into question the whole paradigm of scientific progress after the war. She went on TV on Eric Severide, 1963, and faced just vicious criticism, personal and professional. And this industry chemist, Robert White Stevens, attacked her personally on national televisions. He's an American industry biochemist. Suggestion that pesticides are in fact biocides, destroying all life, is obviously absurd. Miss Carson is a fanatic defender of the cult of the balance of nature. Well, she certainly was. And here's a little mosquito that got away. And he further said, if men were to follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages. The insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. He says this on CBS News TV, 1963. So the disparity between the two of them was shocking, and of course her work has stayed with us. A couple of stories about me, make quick. I started in a dark room, literally a dark room, that was filled with toxic chemicals we know nothing about at the time. And I switched from photography. I have a master's, in fact, in film from Columbia University. Then I switched to public health. I have a doctor of public health. And when I made that switch, I was at Columbia, and Ansel Adams called me and said, you have to help me. You have a double background, film toxicology, and I need for you to write a book. I said, no, I'm too busy. I'm getting my degree. He said, no, this is very important. Photographers are dying, and I know it's the chemicals, but we can't prove it. So I said yes, and started investigating. Most of the chemicals, in fact, were trade secrets and had fancy names. But we were able to crack the code by going up to Kodak and talking to them in a kind of, I would say, surreptitious way as a graduate student. Anyway, we found the health effects of these chemicals once you knew what they were, and they were really not just about irritation. They were serious effects like cancer, brain damage, and reproductive effects. So I wrote this book, comes out in '83, and Kodak went on the warpath and said, it was all exaggerated, and the beautiful chemicals could not possibly be that dangerous. But at any rate, the photography community heard the message and changed what they were doing in the darkroom very fast. Stopped letting kids come in the darkroom, stopped letting the wife come in the kitchen darkroom, and in fact moved the darkroom out of the house and got ventilation, protective clothing, and so forth. So we changed this field. We made a big change, and I was very proud to be part of that, although it was quite a battle. A second story is about my experience with the BP oil spill in 2010. this is the worst environmental disaster that's ever occurred in the United States. All these workers killed. The gas was spewing. We were responding by spraying these toxic chemicals, the Corexit dispersants on top of the petroleum spill. And what struck me was right early on was that they were spinning the information, and we were shocked. There was denial that there was any big problem. They said they didn't want to cause public alarm. And then there was a lot of deception and disinformation going around, like there's probably only 1,000 gallons a day. Well, it turned out it was about 100,000 spewing. The vast majority of the oil is gone. No, it wasn't eaten up by the microbes. Not true. There are no plumes. Not true. And then the dispersants are harmless was a real good one. They said that Corexit is as safe as Dawn dishwashing detergent, but it contains this chemical. It's a solvent that causes internal bleeding. And they knew about this from the Exxon Valdez spill. So I said, I do not think that is true, because if you wash with Corexit your dishes a couple of days, you won't have any hands left. BP went around, told workers they would be fired if they wore a respirator. Why? PR. It would look bad. They told the guys on the shrimp boats, the workers that were in contact with this terrible hot toxic oil, they said they were passing out because they were having heat stress. And then I found in the, Exxon libraries, the recommended gear for their workers handling Corexit, which it looks like a spacesuit. And then those people were not wearing anything. You saw the bare arms. So I dove into the Gulf to look at the chemistry between the Corexit and the oil. And I saw underwater, it's breaking up the oil into tiny pieces. It's releasing solvent all over the place. It's a fiery solvent. And it's making the oil more bioavailable to anything under there. And as I was going down, I was diving not in a scuba outfit, but all covered up. And I don't know how to go back. Anyway, here, maybe that'll help. Does this go back? Okay. Anyway, I started seeing dead things around me, and so my colleague and I got out. And now we're having a little problem with this. Do we know what to do? Next. Okay. So we wrote a memo to the agencies and said, in fact, that the combination of these chemicals can cause DNA damage and cancer, and there's no complete level of exposure. And these people are indeed in grave danger of life-crippling health problems. And that's exactly what happened. I reported this on a couple of TED Talks. But the syndrome, what tied all the people together was that they had this syndrome. They had Gulf Coast syndrome. They had shaking of the hands. I interviewed numbers of them. Heart palpitations. They had memory loss, seizures, nervous system, couldn't remember anything, liver damage, holes in the skin, big ulcers, and they were, these are people that are in their 40s and were healthy 2 months ago, but worked on the spill. So what BP did, the denial thing, got so far along that they were arrogant enough to tell the sick people to keep quiet, and they told the doctors to tell people that it was in their heads. And actually, we found out later, 7 years later, the NIH did this federal study, found out that they weren't crazy at all. They were indeed correct about the connection between the oil spill and their health effects. And this paper came out, Chemicals Used in the Deepwater Horizon Spill, are harmful to people, finally. So the science wins again. I was part of that. I was, again, shocked to hear BP response to all this is to claim that the Gulf is safe. Come on down. They put $195 million into ads, advertising, truth in advertising, right? So by last year, Trump coming in, who's really waging a war on science. As you know, we've been in it for 2 years. Very effective war on science. He rolls back the safety rules on drilling that Obama had put in place, and also tried to open all the coastal waters to offshore drilling. But just last week, a U.S. judge, this is very interesting because they halted hundreds of projects, offshore drilling projects, on the basis of climate change, saying that the company had not factored in the harm that would do to the earth from releasing all this oil and gas. So our challenge now, and something I'm deeply involved in, is the problem of climate change and plastics. They are evil twins. They're related. Why? Plastic is petroleum. All plastic's made from petroleum monomer polymer. And we are in the fossil fuel age. I do believe we're getting out of it. I see the light at the end of the tunnel, but this guy is, if you talk about women in science, you're not, and you talk about Trump and his impact, you have to say it's been absolutely smashingly terrible. And we're in a war. Here's what the war looks like. It's fossil fuels all the way, the planet be damned, gutting of health protections, environmental protections, removing data from the websites. Climate change science is not to be talked about, firing scientists and getting out of the Paris Climate Treaty. But here we have a game changer, which in a strange way, the climate change, this is an existential threat. This may unite all of us, I believe. It's so dire, and it's happening so fast now. We have so much evidence that has been amassed that I believe this is going to bring the world together, and indeed we'll see how that is going to happen. The threat is so obvious to everyone. No matter where you live, you don't escape it. I just went to the Caribbean for a honeymoon, a late honeymoon. I would say, that's not going to be a story I'm going to tell. But in the French Caribbean, the islands are wrecked. There's like the island of Saint Martin, there's only 20% of the real estate is back. And, the wreckage, the damage is just so all around us. Paradise is lost. Paradise is no more. And if we keep going, our world, so we have the hurricanes, we have the wildfires in California, we have relocation of millions of people, we have disease and deaths. And with all these toxic events, the flooding, the wildfires, you have toxic chemicals coming up, either through the smoke of the fire or through the flooding, moving things around. And the reason why is because our homes and our buildings are full of plastics. Plastics is the poster child of post-war success. And remember, in The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman talks to his father's colleague who says, I have one word for you, this will make you a successful man, and that was plastics. Plastics. So what's happening now is a rather horrifying. It's the elephant in the room because we have a boom in the United States in cheap shale gas from fracking. We have more gas than we can use in the pipeline. What isn't used, which is about 80%, it goes straight into plastic production. The chemical industry, I would say the oil and gas industries, are licking their chops, spending, it's 180 billion now on, and it's 333 new plastic production plants. Where are they? They're in Texas. They're in Louisiana. The whole Gulf Coast, pardon me, I get excited about this. And they're also in the Midwest Ohio Valley. But they're huge. And the largest one, one of the investors was a Saudi. And it's a Saudi deal that happened with Exxon when Trump was over there doing the sword dance in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if you remember that. But plastic production's now predicted to double by 2030. And this will, if you think we have a plastics problem now, which I do, our oceans are choking with plastics. The fragments of the plastics, the microplastics, are polluting the biosphere. They're getting into our food, our water, they're in the air, and they're in our bodies. So this is all tied to fossil fuels. Climate crisis, plastics boom. And we can't afford to go through this plastics boom, so we have mounted a coalition, the Plastic Health Coalition, it's international, based out of Amsterdam, and we're going to be prevailing on industry to switch to alternative ways of making plastic-like materials, and those are in the offing. They are not up to scale, but that technology does exist. So there's really some positive news as the fossil fuel age chokes and sputters and tries to punish us as long as possible. Renewable energy. And the marketplace is driving all this. The technology of batteries allowing us to move to solar. Transportation revolution. Green design in materials technology. And then many states and businesses and cities are moving forward anyway with the Paris Climate Agreement tenets. In the future, it's predicted that oil, gas, and coal become stranded assets. The oil industry knows this. We all know this, and they're already investing. Women in science, this is the last story. Who's out there now? Our mores have changed. Our whole social fabric has changed. Our opinions of women, the way we think about women. And women, indeed, have been in there fighting the battle all along. They've never given up, but now we're getting recognition, and women are emerging as leaders and leading us into the future we're going to want to live in. And here's one, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who has come up with the Green New Deal. She was a biochemistry major, almost went into science, and then went straight into policy, but she has a science background, and this is a fabulous, it's a vision, really, of the steps we need to take and how quickly we need to move. And what she says is, this is the fight of our lives. This is the fight for our lives. And many, many people believe her. This will be a change in our whole social economic fabric, and I believe it's coming. And then a teenager from Sweden, little Greta Thunberg, who has spoken at Davos and the UN Climate Conference, and she started the school strike for climate. And she speaks very plainly to everybody who listens to her. She has, I would say she's not fearless, but she's close to it. What we do or don't do right now, me and my generation can't undo in the future. And she says, why should I be studying for a future that soon will be no more when no one is doing anything whatsoever to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts in the school system when the most important facts given by the finest science of that same school system clearly means nothing to our politicians and our society. Finally, I leave you with Frances Arnold, who's bringing innovation to chemistry. She has created the evolution of enzymes, and it sounds esoteric, but enzymes are proteins that catalyze reactions, and these are being used to create environmentally friendly materials, including biofuels, medicines, pharmaceuticals. So it's moving us toward renewable energy, renewable fuels, and replacing toxic chemicals. So her words are, if you're going to change the world, you've got to be fearless. This is something all women have always known. Thank you, and I hope to get to meet a lot of you today.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Glad to see that everybody made it back through the tunnel. Thanks to the random staff people that helped us find our way. So I'm particularly excited to introduce you to our next group of speakers because I first became involved with SWG as one of the New York Group Fellows back when I was at Hunter College some number of years ago. So please help me welcome SWG Fellows Kelsey Brain, Katie Glover, and May Miller to discuss advancing women's representation in geographic research.
Okay, so I am Kelsey Brain, and Katie and May will go next. Good afternoon. I'm so very honored to be here with all of these amazing women scholars. This morning was such a joy. I'm excited about the rest of the talks that we have. I also wanted to just express my gratefulness and what the Society of Women Geographers has meant for me. I am a recipient of the Evelyn Pruitt Fellowship, which was immensely helpful for me in completing my dissertation research. So really, it's just a pleasure to be able to be here to share some from that. So as I mentioned, my name is Kelsey. I am a dual title PhD candidate at the Pennsylvania State University in the Departments of Geography and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Today I'm going to be sharing a little bit from my dissertation research, which was in Costa Rica, which I completed last year. So I'm just going to be focusing on one part of that, kind of the part where I'm sort of looking at differences within the community. And as well, I want to kind of explore my own positionality in my research and how it was fluid and how I related to people. Sorry, is that, because I keep going back and forth, is the audio weird? Is that better? Yes? It's better? Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, so my dissertation research broadly is looking at changes in land use, livelihoods, and communal identity on the Caribbean Talamanca coast in Costa Rica. So here's a map you can see in the small map in the right-hand corner, the red box. This is my study area. It's on the very southern Caribbean coast. It includes about 8 communities, which over the past 25 years or so have kind of dramatically and rapidly become a popular destination for foreign visitors, both tourists, international tourists, but also people who are deciding to migrate there. So people from Europe, the US, and Canada who are deciding to move there to begin a new life, whether it's as a retiree or younger. Either way, there's many of both there. But I'm looking at how the arrival of foreigners, both tourists and migrants, has transformed the region economically, changed how people access land and are able to afford housing. And the part that I'm talking about today is really looking at how these impacts are different across communities, or across community members according to gender, race, class, and other socially ascribed differences. So just to very briefly set the context, I was working in the district of Kavita here in the province of Limon in the canton of Talamanca, which you can see on the bigger map is the darkest blue. This is the percent of Afro-descendant residents living in these cantons in Costa Rica. So my district on the smaller map is the kind of long one along the coast, Kavita. And I want to just kind of give some context for why it has been a historically primarily Afro-descendant community within Costa Rica. The Costa Rican government is largely comprised, until recently, of really people descended from the Spanish colonial government of Costa Rica. So these coastal towns were actually originally settled by Afro-descendant migrants who arrived from Caribbean islands, most primarily Jamaica in the 1800s, to work on the construction of a railroad between the capital city in the San Jose and Limon, and also banana plantations that were owned by a U.S. businessman, Minor Keith, who you may know is was one of the founders of the United Fruit Company, which has now become Chiquita Banana, and was a very pivotal company in Central America in the 18 and early 1900s. So he brought these migrants in from Jamaica to work on these banana plantations, and they're the ones who really settled this coastline, but they lived with very severe discrimination and isolation from the Costa Rican government. So, for example, I'm not going to list all the things, but for example, they were not given citizenship nor the right to have titled land until the 1950s. And then in the 1930s, 1934, when the United Fruit Company pulled out of the Caribbean province, the Costa Rican government passed a law preventing hiring Afro-descendants in any other part of Costa Rica, which basically prevented them from leaving the Caribbean province. So because of these very racist policies within Costa Rica, the region was primarily Afro-descendant until very recently, about the last 25 years, when it's really opened up suddenly to international tourism and the arrival of migrants. And this has led to a transformation in the economy from agriculture and fishing into tourism-based economy, and as well as changes in who owns land and how you're able to access land and what the pricing of housing is. Okay. So today, I'm not going to talk too much about my research results. A little bit I will, but I really want to just paint a picture by telling a few stories. So I would like to talk about my positionality and just a couple of the people that I really got to know while I was down there. So I was studying in Costa Rica for 11 months as a single mom with my two children, who were at the time 4 and 6 years old. These are them. And so they really did this whole research project with me. They would go to my interviews with me. This is the picture with the ocean is them in the Manzanillo Wildlife Refuge. And the other one is us exploring an old deserted cacao farm where they used to grow chocolate. So the farmer was kind of giving us a tour. You'll notice that they did not wear shoes the entire time we were there. So one of the things that really contributed to my relationship with the people that I worked with was the fact that I was a mother there with these two young children. However, one of the things that I really learned to kind of think about and critique was that my identity there and how I related to people was very fluid, so that at times it was really the fact that I was a mother had played a big role, but then at other times it played a much less important role, and things like my education status or my whiteness or the fact that I was from the US, those things played, or that I was single, sometimes those things played a more important role. So that's part of what I want to talk about today as well. So part of the question that motivated me in this, some of the questions for this talk, and thinking through both the differences that were in the community and how I saw those differences, I wanted to kind of think through how did being a single mother of two children, but also at the same time an educated white woman from the global north, shape my research encounters and how I interpreted those encounters. And what might this suggest about the ways that women's varied experiences might contribute to a richer understanding, or to a rich understanding of any research topic. So really recognizing that women's experiences are very varied, and that there's no essential women's experience. And that someone else, another woman, may have encountered this research in really different ways than I did. So the first kind of story I want to tell you, and I'm hoping it will sort of illustrate the ways that the local community is impacted by the arrival of foreigners in very different ways, are these two people that I met early on in my time there. So the first was an Afro-descendant gentleman who I'm calling Gilbert, and I'm using pseudonyms to protect their participant anonymity. But Gilbert was the gentleman that I rented my first house from. He had inherited land from his father, so he owned some land, and then he had recently married a woman from the United States, and so together they had kind of pooled their financial capital, and she had a whole network of connections and a social network and social capital in the United States, and they were able to purchase more land and build a total of 7 units for rent to both migrants and tourists. And so through this, they were able to acquire a significant amount of rental income from the foreigners who were arriving. I remember one of the first questions that I had was because he had a previous wife who actually still lived in a little house at the back of his property, and kind of wondering, I wonder how she has experienced the arrival of foreigners and if that has been different for her. But sadly, I never was able to get to know her very well, but I did, however, get to know a woman named Maya, who was Gilbert's second cousin. And Maya, he and his wife hired her to clean and do laundry for their various rentals. So Maya and I became friends because she had a 7-year-old son who came over to my house pretty much every day and played with my kids. And we would cook together. He's the one who taught me how to make patacones from plantains. So that was really fun. He stood in the pan to smash the plantains into patacones, so that was pretty fun. But anyways, she was also going through a separation from her husband, and since I had previously been through a separation, we were able to connect on that point. In talking to Maya, I was really struck by the dramatic difference in how Gilbert and Maya had been impacted by the arrival of foreigners to the region, foreigners like myself in a lot of ways. So while foreigners had provided considerable rental income to Gilbert and also the opportunity to marry into financial and social capital, the impacts for Maya were not so obviously beneficial. Although the arrival of foreigners has brought more opportunities for wage employment in cooking and cleaning, those wages remain very low. The average is about $2 an hour, and the work is demanding and inconsistent depending on the tourist season. At the same time, the arrival of foreigners has greatly driven up the prices of housing and food in the area. And so this growing inequality that is occurring because of this has led to an increase in crime and the disappearance of an economy that was really based on sharing within the community, which was an economy that Maya really depended on in the past. So I want to return to my positionality really quick because I've talked a little bit about being a mom there, but also I was also a single woman, white from a relatively wealthy country, and I found that it was actually very challenging to form strong relationships with the young local women there because there was a considerable amount of distrust, which it seemed over talking to people for a long time that a lot of that came because there was a growing number of romantic and sexual relationships between local men and foreign women. As these women were coming and increasingly arriving, and they were oftentimes very attracted to this sort of Caribbean male Rasta figure. There were, and they also served as a source of livelihood for local men. So there were many relationships forming, and the women felt a certain amount of distrust with the foreign women who were coming in. And so this proved to be a real challenge for me, although I was, it just proved to be a real challenge that sometimes my having children was able to kind of help me navigate, and other times not so much. One of the young women who I was able to get very close to, I'm going to call her Ellen, and she was a 27-year-old Afro-descendant woman with 3 young children. And I found in talking to Ellen some really interesting insights on how gender played out in that community. So although Ellen's grandfather had owned a lot of land in the 1980s, all of it had been sold or small bits had been given to other family members. And at this point, Ellen did not own any land, and her siblings did not own any land. So she married when she became pregnant with her first son at 16 years old. She's worked service jobs ever since then. She currently works at a coffee shop that's owned by a North American migrant. And she says this coffee shop is the best work that she's had since she started working 11 years ago. She's paid almost $5 an hour, while most of her friends are only making $2 an hour. Ellen has been the sole provider for her family of 5, her husband and her 3 children, since the time that she had her first son. She told me that this is largely because her husband has been unable to get a job because foreign-owned businesses and individuals are hesitant, these are her words, to hire local men because they are perceived to be lazy and or troublesome. She said, however, if they are especially handsome, they will have no trouble getting a job because they can work as a bartender, a tour guide, or a surf instructor. So my interactions with Ellen led me to think really critically about how the arrival of foreigners are impacting local community members along gender lines, but also not just gender, kind of how that's interacting with race and other physical, age and other physical characteristics. So as Ellen described, local men are often excluded from wage employment due to their stereotyped reputations as troublesome or lazy, and this is resulting in women taking a lot of the wage employment jobs, jobs which are often low wage, long hours, and hard working conditions, doing cooking and cleaning. And the responsibility of providing for the household is increasingly falling to women in this community. However, those men who are considered especially handsome, or those who, like Gilbert, owned land or were able to have a marriage that provided significant capital, were able to benefit from the arrival of foreigners. So again, kind of looking at some of the characteristics, owning land that intersected with gender in the ways that these community members were impacted by the arrival of foreigners. So, in thinking intersectionally, feminist theorists have encouraged scholars to move away from binary thinking, and this is one of the things that I've encountered a lot in the tourism literature and also in the literature on these migrations from the global north to the global south, is kind of this creation of a dichotomy between the foreigner and the local. And while there certainly is inequality there, and I don't want to minimize that, I think that we oversimplify if we focus just on that dichotomy and we forget the multiplicity of experiences that both foreigners and locals have in these communities. So instead, I find the analytical framework of intersectionality very useful. This is a framework which has been really championed by Black feminists, thought of and championed by Black feminist theorists such as Kimberly Crenshaw. She was the one who coined the term intersectionality. Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Audre Lorde, many others who have worked hard to show that gender never operates alone, that it is intersecting with other power systems to cause marginalization. So I found that was super important to think about in my research site. I also, and I think this kind of goes along with that idea of intersectionality, was thinking about the ways that I interacted with people and thinking about my positionality not as a laundry list of differences to check off between myself and the people that I interacted with, but that my positionality was very, very fluid, and that depending on who I was interacting with, various characteristics or our relationships, certain things were more or less important or mattered in different ways with interactions with different people. And I have found recently that there's actually a very solid body of research being done to kind of try to complicate our understandings of positionality and consider more the fluidity that we see here. So, for example, Faria and Millett really look at race that way, talking about how race is socioculturally and geographically contingent and does not always, provide predictable power relations between a researcher and a research participants. Others also have emphasized the ways that our positionalities are fluid and trying to think through, like Ellen Cole and Priscilla McCutcheon, I believe, have talked about using everyday talk to try to process through the fluidity of our positionalities. So that's really all I have for you today. Thank you for for your support, and I look forward to having more conversations with you.
All right. So I'm Katie Glover. Thanks so much for the invite to speak today. I'm visiting from the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine, where I am now a postdoctoral researcher, and I was a fellowship recipient while I was still at the University of California, Los Angeles, where I earned my PhD in 2016. So I study paleo records, and what I do with these is to look at landscapes that have changed as a response to climate change in the past. What I aim to do today is talk a little bit about the life cycle of what that type of research looks like, what it's like to work with sediment cores. I'll talk about some of the projects I've worked on, results that I've found, and also what it's like to be a woman in this field since the start of really what I see as my research career in 2001. So I had my start in science in a geology department. My professors in this small department were all men. Several had become professors after working for oil companies. So the first thing I learned how to find underground were oil traps. I never used that expertise in my career to come. But afterwards, I went to the University of Cincinnati for my master's, and I discovered there's a whole world of climate science research and more recent geologic past, surface processes, how landscapes have changed that I felt I really hadn't been exposed to in my undergraduate curriculum. So this is also where I had my first exposure to coring small basins and lakes, working on fieldwork teams. And I got to do this all around Ohio, Indiana, the Upper Great Lakes, and Canada during the 3 years that I was there. So I'll talk a bit about what the life cycle of this research is like with a few cartoons and pictures. So during fieldwork, we take cores out of the ground and are looking specifically for lake sediments. Lake bottoms often don't have oxygen over their history, so it's a really good place to preserve environmental material. And if you ever have a smoothie or boba tea and put a straw in with your thumb over it, you get some suction and some material comes out. That's basically what we're doing with this coring system, and we just take it out 1 meter at a time. So here I am in Ohio troubleshooting equipment, and then working with students as well to use that tripod to start recovering cores. If you never got rid of that childhood desire to play in the dirt, this is a great line of work to go into. For my master's, I was ultimately interested in this question. So when and how did deglaciation happen in Ohio, Indiana? And this might seem like flyover part of the country, but this is where the Laurentide ice sheet came down its furthest south. It really dipped down over Ohio. So we can learn a lot about rates of retreat and then ice caps melting today from looking at timing and then rate that southernmost section kind of collapsed and then retreated back at the end of the last ice age. After field work comes lab work. You have these cores you can split open into open faces for sampling. This is a muffle furnace with small crucibles in them. Each has a small sample in it, and we burn that at really high temperatures to find out how much material burns off. That's your organic content in the lake. And you can tell a lot about the environment. Oftentimes it's a warming signal if the organic material kicks up, or it might mean that solar radiation increased. And usually that's tied to what's getting deposited into the basin, or maybe the algae population exploded and that made the organics go up. Once you have all your data collected, the analysis and putting it together can be tricky, especially establishing the age of these sequences. And when I cored around Ohio and Indiana, I was really looking for material at the very, very bottom of these sequences. If there's a stray seed or twig that gets in there, that tells you minimum age of exposure. So you assume that ice sheet was gone and that basin was there ready to start receiving material. So I did a lot of radiocarbon dating to help come up with these sequences and then develop that history over time. And then synthesis. I really like, even though I was in a geology program, this is kind of an inherently geographic approach to look at things in space and time, right? Not just one site, but whole networks of site. And they're all a little noisy and might show slightly different patterns, but we're interested in aggregate in what patterns they show about timing, retreat, warming, environmental age, and I really looked at that over Indiana and Ohio as I was wrapping up my master's. So just a blow up of that synthesis picture of the Midwest. We have got the place where the ice sheet retreated. So the original extent is in that blue dashed line there. And then those numbers is the time that that lake was exposed in thousands of years. And previously, the story was that that maximum extent of the ice sheet was 20,000 years old. But my work changed the story of that a little bit. We had some literature sites, especially right on the margin, that actually were exposed ahead of time. And if you can see some of the 19.6, 18,000 years ago, a lot of Ohio was pretty exposed fairly quickly after 20,000 years. So together these data suggest that collapse of that part of the ice sheet had happened earlier and faster than previously believed. So by about 17,500 years ago, it looks like that ice sheet was completely gone from most of Ohio. So I include a couple pictures here to show what I did my third year of my master's as I was synthesizing these Midwestern data. My advisor had a new grant to start a project to look for glacial meltwater outlets all throughout Canada and then those upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior region and Michigan, etc. So I stayed on for a year full time and I helped organize these field campaigns. I went on the field campaigns and I was managing the research lab at the time. It was a lot, probably about the work of 2 full-time jobs in and of itself. But this really is probably the most time I have spent continuously in the field, was being able to go and core at all of these sites. And it's really exciting work, but I would go for weeks at a time, often as the only woman on the team. And especially in that Ontario picture, by this point in summer, we had 12, 14 hours of daylight, and we worked during that whole time, every single day. I had to reckon with the fact that towards the end of my master's, I was really approaching burnout from doing both. And this is where I think, for women in the geosciences especially, role models really matter. You know, we heard earlier today about one of the speakers mentioned one woman professor in her department in the 70s. This was the early 2000s for me, and there still was only one woman geology professor in both my undergrad and master's programs combined. So this is why we really need to expand the field. I had just turned 25. I felt that academic research was very cutthroat, very competitive, very grueling as well. And so I left academia for a long time. I landed in North Carolina within a year after some family visits and travel, and I was a high school teacher. I was hired to develop earth science curriculum and work on updating the elective class, the environmental science curriculum. So these are a couple fun pictures from that time period. I really liked I had a lot of freedom to design my own labs and design my own curriculum. And this was a private school as well, so a lot of resources for that. Huge population of students that had learning disabilities as well. So in this age of so much objective testing and pressure for college admissions, I really saw the kids light up when they could do hands-on experiments, collaborate together, set them with a task or a challenge or a question, and kind of let them create. And here they are with building models that we tested on this springboard for earthquakes. That was kind of crazy, but this is probably one of the more fun things I did, I think, was being able to design these inquiry-based activities for students. I still felt that pull, however, towards designing my own research and projects. So I knew I'd have to listen to that ambition eventually and apply to grad school again and continue my pursuit of science. And I knew I always wanted that doctor more than I wanted the misses at the end of this. So I landed at UCLA Geography. I was fortunate to have that opportunity and be accepted to a top-ranked program after a long gap. And here I'll go through the life cycle of a coring project again and just talk about that a little bit more in terms of what we can really tell from doing these analyses, results that I found, and it's actually extended into the work that I do for my postdoc now, which is working at the La Brea tar pits, which is right in Los Angeles. So the lakeside I worked on is in the San Bernardino Mountains, and this part of California was never completely under ice, so you can get lake sequences that go back farther in time and show multiple glacial cycles. And then this is the La Brea tar pits, and I'll mention that the SWG fellowship allowed me to stay in residence in LA for 2 summers, which is expensive, but I was able to advance the geochemistry analysis I had put in the proposal at the time, and I started volunteering 1 day a week, excavating at the tar pits. That experience ultimately led to the postdoc work that I'm doing now. So again, field work, this time it was really cool to target a site that was so sensitive. It's right on this transition between Mediterranean biome in the green, and then Mojave Desert is there in the pink. And I was really curious as to like what types of change that had seen over glaciers. I organized the drilling campaign. Instead of setting up a manual tripod, we got to hire a team, and they recovered 85 continuous feet of material from the lake bed that day, which is pretty exciting. It makes for a huge dissertation project, but I know the society really likes this picture, which was taken that first day when we took the material out of the ground, and I was very excited. We could see through those plastic tubes very visible change happening that was probably caused by solar cycles. For the lab work, this extended during my PhD to include more analyses. So we did the organics again, and for such a simple analysis, this ended up being really important for showing those solar cycles over time. That impacted the algae population that would sort of come and go in the lake, depending on whether it was a glacial period or not. And very into student training, I think I had somewhere between 15 to 16 students volunteer in the field or lab and help with this work. 80% of those students were young women. The ones I worked with the most substantively ended up doing capstone projects or becoming co-authors on papers, or they did a report or presentation, and it's been really great to see how their careers have expanded in environment and sustainability careers since then. So the first one shows Alexis with the thumbs up. She's checking magnetics. That tells you a lot about the depositional environment. We have Tamarin Kong. She just cut out slices very neatly. She's very happy about having done that. But we take those slices from the core and then digest them into hydrogen peroxide to filter out the charcoal. And charcoal is often seen as a proxy for the wildfire history of that lake basin over time. Next picture to the right is Sargam. I think we took that picture to Mark. She had done 400 charcoal samples at the time with one of the flasks. And then pollen processing. So fossil pollen is really persistent in the environment. If you're like me and get spring allergies, it not only gets into lungs and kind of disrupts your own system, but it persists for a long time in lakes. And we use some pretty harsh chemicals to remove, oh my goodness. Let's see, is everything okay? Just take a breath. All's okay? All right. So yeah, that's just a sampling of some of the lab analyses that we did to check the environmental history. And each of these is only like one clue towards how the environment changed at the time. Sometimes it's sedimentation, sometimes it's algae, sometimes it's forest. I'll show you one of the cooler results that I worked up. I'll add too, this is me at LACCOR at the University of Minnesota. This facility is the biggest in North America for this type of research. And they've just hugely expanded capacity since I was a master's student. I think it's done a lot to help a lot more folks be involved in this type of research and help with young, early career and student training. So these are the pollen results, and we've got the age on the left, and that green is all of the forest pollen, all of the tree pollen summed together. It mostly comes from pine. And then in orange, we've got the shrubs. And you can see how much it's changed in the environment over time. We've got the last glacial, and there's some change, but about 60,000, 70,000 years ago, you can see how much that shrubland really expanded. And then working up that charcoal history, it's not that remarkable in the early part of the core where there's a lot of change in the forest cover. But it starts to kick up about 70,000 years ago, and it's that time we get sustained forest afterwards that seems to be the best for promoting wildfire. And then the last glacial, we have that flat line. And this was always kind of mind-blowing to tell people in California, as you know, the San Bernardino Mountains are so fire-prone today, but it went for thousands of years during the last glacial without really having any wildfire. And in terms of synthesis, I think the impact of this work kind of highlights what forest might change into in California. In California's mountain forest today, there's extensive tree mortality. About 2010 is when these flyover surveys started trying to gauge estimates of how much the forest had really changed. And it's now 149 million dead trees. And this quote I'm showing towards the end of my slides here is from the agency that does these flyover surveys. I don't know if my research really answers the question of when the forest might change, but it gives a little insight into what. And we have all these times in the past where forest has converted to shrubland. And if that happens, if forests really shift to something else, that allows us to ask questions about what that means for tourism in California. What does that mean for flooding and erosion, especially as we get more extreme weather events in California? What does that mean for uptake of carbon dioxide if you've got shrubland instead of trees? I think these are really important questions to make that 5-year plan, 10-year plan for what could happen in mountains of the West Coast. Because really land management and firefighting right now are in year-to-year triage mode. And for me, shifting from geology to geography department for my PhD, I found was really the place I could ask those types of questions and connect the physical environment with the people that live there, especially surrounding issues of equity and justice. Those conversations came much more naturally in geography than any other workplace I had been in. Being conversant in the social sciences, I feel, is more and more important than ever for those of us that work in climate science. It hugely improved the impact of my own work and my interactions with the public. I feel that culture of my early training was that we would, work hard, be out in the field, stay in labs, generate all this data, and then at some point impart that to the public or publish that peer-reviewed study, and it would speak for itself, and that would motivate politicians and people to change. However, it doesn't work that way. It took a long time for me to learn that kind of coming into that space with that doctor doesn't necessarily mean I'm there to bestow scientific expertise. I'm more there to listen to other people's lived experiences in the environment where we live, and especially that of students too. And if I'm lucky, hopefully I'll encourage and activate folks' own love for the natural environment and motivation to protect the world where we live. But really, this is an act of community building, which I think we as women are really good at doing. We need more of that in climate science. We improve our chances to respond and find solutions to the climate crisis when we have these more diverse, resilient communities. And that includes in the lab, in the field, the neighborhoods where we live, who's in the room when policy is talked about, and who comes to the table. I'm personally really grateful for organizations like the Society of Women Geographers that help foster that type of support and connection and mentorship. I came to DC and the Library of Congress for the first time a few years ago, and it is incredible to see original maps and the history of our country, but it's hard not to visit and come away thinking, well, this is the story of men, and men get to be the founding fathers and the change makers. Showcasing the important work that women are doing in geography in this space today really means a lot to me personally. So I thank you, Mary, the Society of Women Geographers, for your continued support and for what really has been an incredible day so far. And I look forward to that continuing. So thank you.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. It's been a great day so far. I want to start off by thanking Mary for putting the panel together, for all of you for being here, and also thank the Society for supporting my dissertation research. And so I was one of the New York City Fellows, and with the money I was able to conduct research for my dissertation in the United Kingdom, in archives in London, Bristol, and Liverpool. I was also able to conduct research at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. I spent some time at the Library of Congress here in DC, and I was able to attend a 2-week summer school last year in Bologna, Italy, for Global Studies and Critical Theory, where I met with graduate students and faculty from all over the world to think critically about scholarship and research that was grounded in the lived experiences of people in the Global South. So today I'm going to share a bit with you about my experiences doing research as a woman of color and the work that I've done to center the histories and experiences of women of color in maritime studies. And so I will start with some brief vignettes from my research, and then I'll give you some general background about my study, and then I will give some methodological examples for how I'm looking for the stories and listening to the stories of women in the archives of social movements in the 1920s and 30s that I study. I can't quite figure this out. Okay. Can you hear me if it's here? Perfect. And if I use the clicker. Here. Okay. So I want to begin my talk today with a brief vignette from my dissertation research. On a predictably cloudy day in June 2017, I visited the Merseyside Maritime Archive in Liverpool for the first time. When I entered the archive on the second floor of the museum, I found 20 men already seated at the tables. They all knew each other. At the table next to me, the men, all white and over the age of 60, recounted recent vacations to so-called affordable but lousy places, such as South Africa and Sri Lanka. No one mentioned Britain's role in the underdevelopment of these places, or how the exploitation of seafarers from these countries produced British naval power. They were part of a local enthusiast club and had come to discuss the models of ships, rather than their cargo or the geopolitics of colonial shipping. Here the sea was understood as a site of leisure, adventure, and ingenuity, rather than a site of human suffering. The research librarian was puzzled when I asked for the records of a shipping line that operated between Liverpool and the ports in what is present-day Ghana and Nigeria. I explained to him that I wanted to understand how the company transitioned from transporting of black bodies through the slave trade to the exploitation of black labor in the shipment of palm and cacao, and whether the company records detailed any instances of local resistance. Yeah, they were a little shocked. So the morning was a stark reminder of how both my body and line of inquiry are out of place within and antagonistic to maritime studies, which remains a largely masculinist and colonial project. Indeed, as a young black woman, my position as a researcher is often unbelievable and called into question in archives throughout the UK and the US, where I am regularly chosen for random security checks, require extra surveillance when dealing with documents, or am presumed to be lost or a staff member rather than a scholar. Experiences such as these have been well documented by scholars of color throughout Europe and North America. Black women are unbelievable as both as scholars and as the subjects of maritime history. Yet, as geographer Catherine McKittrick argues, attention to the not-quite spaces, sites of struggles, and stories of displacement that constitute Black women's geographies not only fill in the gap in traditional historical and geographic knowledge, but more importantly, can chart a path towards more humanly workable futures. My talk today is divided into two parts. In part one, I will give a brief overview of my dissertation research on the anti-colonial activism of Black and South Asian seafarers in the early 20th century. In the second part, I will explain my methodological approach to looking for and listening to the quotidian presence and practices of women of color within these maritime networks and spaces. Attention to these spatial practices can in turn shed new light upon the routes and contours of diasporic community formation, political education, and transnational social movements during this period. And let me just quickly say, I've just finished the data collection, so what I will share with you today is an overview of the questions that have guided my inquiry, rather than a completed analysis of what I have found. And so, I study the ways that Black maritime workers circulated information and formed connections and solidarities across the Atlantic in the early 20th century. I ask how these networks formed, what kinds of political education these workers underwent in port cities, and how the movements of maritime workers, as they traveled to various ports, expanded the transnational scope and capacities of anti-racist and anti-colonial movements. I focus primarily on the period during and after World War I, so 1914 to 1939, and on movements and networks routed through 6 port cities in the United States, United Kingdom, and the Caribbean. These are New York City, New Orleans, London, Cardiff, Kingston, and Port of Spain. Merchant ships in port cities were not only integral to the extraction of resources, movement of commodities, and accumulation of capital, but also set in motion the mass movements of labor, circulation of ideas, and coordination of collective capacities that exceeded and negated the global order of racial capitalism. As Paul Gilroy has argued in his foundational text, The Black Atlantic, the ship is a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, which brings into sharp analytic focus the discontinuous histories of England's ports and its interface with the wider world. British merchant shipping was contingent upon and constituted by complex regimes of coerced mobility, immobilization, and mobile enclosures, which facilitated the hyper-flexible circulation of capital and commodities through the production of cheap, racially differentiated workforce. Sailors hired in colonial ports, such as Kingston and Calcutta, were tasked with the most difficult and dangerous jobs, usually working as stokers in the engine room. In addition, they were paid 1/7 to 1/3 of the wages of unionized British sailors and allotted fewer cubic meters and smaller food rations aboard ships, all of which heightened vulnerability to premature death. In the 1920s, Black and South Asian workers organized themselves to challenge these working conditions and the racism of the British National Union of Seamen. Yet, these workers also understood their labor struggles as bound up with broader movements for self-determination and against racial and colonial violence. Accordingly, Black maritime workers distributed radical and often illegal periodicals, such as the Negro Worker here, across national and colonial borders, and also shared musical records and Black books, such as Claude McKay's Banjo, throughout Atlantic ports. They coordinated boycotts in defense of Ethiopia against Italian occupation in the 1930s, and strikes throughout the Caribbean in the cause of freedom. Through the transmission of oral and written news and stories, these workers served as a vital link, keeping their communities informed of struggles across the Black world. The struggles of Black women circulated through these networks. For example, in May 1932, Ada Wright addressed the First World Congress of Seafarers held in Hamburg, Germany. Wright was the mother of 2 of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 African-American teenagers who were falsely charged with the rape of 2 white women in Alabama. Wright's address to the seafarers was part of a transnational campaign to raise awareness and support for the legal defense. The maritime delegates unanimously passed a resolution demanding freedom from the Scottsboro Boys and pledged to carry their struggle for liberation into every port, ship, and harbor in which they touched. In several documented instances, sailors held teach-ins on the Scottsboro trial in their bunks below deck. Wright's appeal is part of a long tradition of political mothering on the part of Black women in the face of state sanction and extra-legal violence against their children. And we can see how the seafarers, along with journalists and other activists, amplified the reach of this story and deepened capacities for solidarity. Another way that we can see the circulation of feminist activism and critique through maritime networks is through attention to the content of the periodicals that seafarers distributed, such as the Negro Worker. For example, a February 1937 issue reported on a proposal by British authorities to introduce compulsory sterilization and population control in Bermuda. The author argued that the policy amounted to violence against and the violation of Black women's bodies, and traced this historically back to the transatlantic slave trade. At the same time, the author argued that the uneven resource distribution and long history of colonial expropriation were the true issues at hand, rather than overpopulation. Here again, we can see the intersectional critique indexed through and amplified by maritime networks. Beyond attention to the kinds of stories that circulated through these networks, I am interested in the quotidian places and practices through which Black women shared these stories themselves, and in doing so, shaped and refashioned the meaning of the maritime. Writing on the origin stories of Liverpool's Black seafaring community, anthropologist Jacqueline Nassy Brown has argued that rather than seeking a gender balance in diaspora studies, i.e. highlighting the few women who did work on ships, scholars should consider how gender ideologies, quote, determine the different social and physical locations that men and women can legitimately occupy. Such an approach considers the meanings of seafaring and the power asymmetries that shape presence in, production of, and movement through diasporic spaces. To engage in the fleshy, messy stuff of everyday life, a phrase I borrow from geographer Cindy Katz, requires reading across multiple repositories and genres, from memoirs of Black radicals to the logs of missionary societies, from the records of the colonial office and customs officials to novels and oral histories. It entails attention to fleeting and often unremarkable references, reading between and speculating from silences, and listening to images, such as this one of women working as construction workers in Trinidad, listening to the images on multiple registers. Let me now give 3 brief examples of how these insights have informed my approach to earth writing and unearthing Black women's historical geographies. First, attention to place-specific quotidian histories complicates conventional understandings of dock work and dock workers. Within Euro-American ports, the labor of loading and unloading cargo and carrying goods to port overwhelmingly falls upon men. Yet, when we look to the Caribbean, we find that the labor of market women and women as dock workers was crucial for regional and transnational circulation. Accordingly, research must consider not only how stories and ideas were transmitted across contexts marked by difference, but how these spatial differences refashioned and reconstituted the categories and contours of politics. We can ask, for example, how the anti-colonial networks of the early 20th century were built upon and shaped by the long insurgent knowledge traditions and routes of Black Caribbean women whose collaborations and exchanges with seafarers can be traced back to the slave rebellions of the 17th century. Second, my research considers the range of social reproductive labor that happens in and around the docks and asks how political consciousness was formed and circulated through these spaces. I shift the focus from the pages of radical periodicals to the places where these ideas were discussed and debated. These include the dockside lunch counters and cafes where workers ate and drank, the dance halls and the rum shacks, the gatherings held for seafarers returning from their voyages, and the boarding house and the brothel. In all of these spaces, women were present, listening, actively shared the news of the day, and contributed their perspectives to political visions. And yet, these places should not be overly romanticized, nor should the sometimes violent contradictions of women's lived realities be diminished. For example, in Claude McKay's novel, which is about this radical Black community of men in Marseille, and is often an example of the political possibilities and exchanges afforded by port communities. The women characters are not only unremarked in their absent presence, but are framed as disposable and indeed antagonistic to the masculine freedom dreams articulated by the protagonists. And so by attending to the politics of gender through these everyday practices, routes, and expressions, we can shed new light on the meanings of the maritime and of liberation itself as we think through these tensions and contradictions. Third, we can consider how and to what ends women utilized and contributed to transnational shipping infrastructures. Here we can look to the foundation of the Black Star Lines by the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1919. The small, independent, Black-owned shipping line was established to challenge racism that Black passengers and workers experienced working on British and American ships, and with the ultimate goal of facilitating the return of the Black diaspora in the Americas back to Africa. The line went bankrupt in 1923 and is often portrayed as a failure because the return voyages to the homeland never came to fruition. And yet, the failure narrative obscures the importance of the Black Star's passenger voyages throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and to New York City. The ships carried primarily women and children throughout the region, often following the labor migrations of their husband. And by shifting the analysis away from the vision of great men such as Marcus Garvey and the simplified notions of failure, we can better understand the impacts of these infrastructures in shaping the circulation of people and the ways that women used these infrastructures and circuits to further spread their ideas, perspectives, and contribute to the ongoing anti-colonial visions, perspectives during this period. So taken together, I argue that these insights offer a blueprint for how we might write Black women into maritime studies, and through these emancipatory spatial imaginings, disrupt maritime studies as a masculinist and colonial project. I will end here and look forward to any questions or feedback during the break. Thank you.
Over it. Good afternoon, I'm Debbie Fugate. I'm Deputy Director of the National Geospatial Program at USGS and an SWG member. And I'm delighted to introduce our next group of speakers. You'll hear from Milena Janiak, Kathleen Mumford, and Maggie Tolson. They're all early career woman geographers, and I've asked them to share their perspectives on essential skills in the federal workplace. Thank you. Or possibly for taller women. Maybe. How can I bring it up? When I was an undergraduate, I used to watch a TV series about fictional Dr. Temperance Brennan, a forensic anthropologist working for the Smithsonian Institution. And I remember thinking, how is it that on the TV they have fascinating jobs like these? I wish they existed in real life. Today, I would like to argue that I have an even better job because I get to evaluate data originating from emerging technologies and solve their mysteries from the comfort of my PC instead of digging through slimy bones. I love my work. We contribute to several programs related to remote sensing and collaborate with local governments and other federal agencies to gather, analyze, and publish geospatial data. However, I would not be able to be successful as my work if other people would not force me to be open-minded, to think critically, and frankly, to enjoy a state of continuously pushing my intellectual capacity. When I started graduate school in a human geography track, my advisor sought to discuss which classes I should take, and she suggested remote sensing. And my response was, why would I take it? I don't need it to graduate. And her retort was, this is the only time in your life when you get to expand your horizons. The question is not why would you take it, but why wouldn't you? And so I took the class grudgingly, but later, because of my educational background, I was hired by the National Geospatial Technical Operations Center, where I work with LIDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging. Last year, all of the job advertisements in our center were seeking geographers and cartographers. And not surprisingly, most repeated terms in the ads included experience, education, and data. However, importantly, each one of these jobs ads mentioned analysis and research as a keyword to inform the candidates about everyday responsibilities. And I think this is a correct way to describe what we do. Honestly, with my human geography background, I was worried about being able to contribute. However, receptiveness and critical thinking are needed across geographical disciplines. The major elements of my work are related to testing new methods of data or gathering data or providing feedback on existing specifications. And who would not be a better suited person for that than a human geographer? You know that we human geographers like to question everything. But in all seriousness, feedback is necessary. For instance, I receive research projects that have no specifications or context on how these data should be treated. And my role is to isolate things which can be standardized. For example, I may ask for better documentation of ground truthing methods. Usually these projects culminate in meetings where I talk to my colleagues about what's new, what's hot, what to read, what to look out for. And this is the picture of a meeting with colleagues from Applied Research section who are developing new software to test LiDAR data. And I organized it to discuss how we can use the software. And my role was to talk about interpreting the results. Because sometimes we may look at statistics and think, oh, I knew that there was something going on there. But we have to force ourselves to look out for the context. And so I talked about how can we visualize the data, how spatial and temporal changes in the area of interest can influence the results. And these types of elaborations can shape the way that we treat data in a more systematic manner, and in the end provide better information and research to the public. I must open my mind to cutting-edge science, and sometimes I look at this latest way to gathering data, and I think, I don't know, I find myself absolutely mesmerized. Marie Skłodowska-Curie had remarked that a scientist is also a child confronting natural phenomena that impress him as though they were fairy tales. There is no greater desire than to get to know as much as I can, but I must force myself to step back and look for the limitations. And while this makes me successful in my job, I struggle with it. And I don't think I'm alone. I think whether or not you're a physical geographer or a human geographer, or whether you rely on qualitative methods or quantitative methods, we may find ourselves reading a publication about a new approach that just came and can't help ourselves but feel a little bit, fascinated, a little bit spellbound. And then we must wake from that spell and think, okay, but what else is out there? What are the limitations to this new method, to this new theory? In this age of increased automation, our abilities to think outside the box, to be creative, to be inquisitive, to engage with critiques set us apart. And these are some necessary skills to serve the public with care. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Maggie Tolson. I would like to state that the views I present are mine alone and do not necessarily represent that of the government, the IC, or the U.S. Marine Corps. So this time 8 years ago, I was finishing up my first GIS course my senior year of high school, and I was already set on a path towards a degree in geography. Since then, I've seen rapid changes in the industry, which has prompted me to have self-motivation to continue to learn. If you've ever heard the phrase, feeling uncomfortable is the key to success, then you understand that getting out of your comfort zone, like I am now, to learn new skills is the key to self-development. I've taken this phrase and repeated it throughout the years. If I could tell my past self one skill that would become vital to my career, it would be personal leadership. The ability to define a direction for your leadership in life and move into that direction with consistency and clarity. At my workplace, I'm joined by a mix of geographers or geospatial analysts like myself, imagery analysts, and scientists. But since geography as a whole has so many components to it, most people I've noticed have taken to one specific niche area. But looking into the future of geography, I suggest that professionals should look outside of their area of interest and into all aspects that geography or GIS can offer. Entering into the government, I realized that being a geographer doesn't entail just one job. We have to think on our feet, be knowledgeable about the products that we can provide to our customers, and constantly be keeping up with the evolving GIS technologies. On the Bureau of Labor Statistics websites and website, in the Occupational Outlook for Geographers, it states, employment of geographers is projected to grow 7% from 2016 to 2026. This is average for most jobs. Yet it also states that geographers should face strong competition for jobs as the number of candidates is expected to exceed the number of available positions. With this knowledge, I've utilized personal leadership by making myself a multifunctional hybrid analyst. For example, I was put on a project at my workplace where I became dependent on imagery analysts for data. Realizing this, I decided to take it upon myself to ask questions and learn how to obtain the information on my own, making me more independent. Doing so streamlined my processes, made me more efficient, and increased my production rates. I decided to not constrain my skill set by focusing on one area of GIS. Constantly being motivated to get out of my cubicle and learn from my colleagues essentially helped me learn a new skill set that I wouldn't have otherwise. Aside from being motivated to be technically more advanced, there is also the point of leading yourself to become a better employee, being a self-starter. Having a positive attitude, engaging with coworkers, and seeking out opportunities are all examples of personal leadership. For example, within my first year of the government, I noticed that there were trainings and programs where the main goal is to enhance employees professionally, so I decided to apply. Last year, I graduated from a 6-month program that basically developed me into a future public service leader. It encompassed job shadowings, management interviews, a developmental assignment, and courses on leadership. During most of these, I felt outside of my comfort zone, but I pushed myself with personal leadership to continue going. And I'm proud that I did because I was having new experiences and learning from people I don't normally interact with. During my developmental assignment with another agency, I was even able to learn a new mapping software that I wouldn't have otherwise. The government is filled with opportunities to progress your career goals, but if you don't take advantage of them, then you'll never realize your full potential. So going back to the phrase I stated at the beginning of this talk, feeling uncomfortable is the key to success. Utilizing personal leadership will push you to grab hold of opportunities that may cause you to feel uncomfortable, but in the end will benefit you greatly. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree about this podium. I can't even see half of the audience over there. I'm going to start my presentation off with a question that I think maybe everyone in this room has heard. Can you help me with a map? I got that question from my husband about 3 months ago on a date night. And I said, sure. Luckily, he was looking for a heat map, and everyone thinks those are kind of sexy. So I asked him, what do you mean by a heat map? And he said, you know, the kind that goes from one color to another. And I'm like, oh, you mean a choropleth map? And he's choropleth map. Yeah, that's what I mean. So we had a discussion, and I enhanced his geo-vocabulary, and we finally got to the point where I realized I can help him with what he needs, and I think it would be beneficial for both of us because he'll understand what I do for 8+ hours a day, and we'll connect. It'll be great, and it'll give us something to do on Saturday nights if we're short on money. And cool, no problem. We can do this. Unfortunately, the software he had was ArcGIS Pro, and I hadn't really touched that. I've lived in ArcMap for about 15 years. I opened it up on his computer, and I said, where's the map? And then I said, where's the Add Data button? And I couldn't work my way around it. And I realized that after 15 years of living in ArcMap and after a significant amount of time in the federal government, I had kind of fallen behind of what the outside world was doing and what the standards were becoming. And so my focus is on maintaining relevance outside of your office and bringing that relevance back into your office in the federal government. It really was an experience working with my husband to do this, and I also learned about being able to translate that. So not only maintaining your own relevance, but bringing that relevance to other people in your office. Bringing it up, so managing up with GIS, bringing it to your colleagues who understand geography and GIS, but also bringing it to your clients who don't know that they want GIS. They don't know what geography is. They went to a geography bee or something and they know about places, but they don't know geography, right? And we're all geographers. So I signed up. The way I went about this is I signed up for a class, and I signed up for an Esri class, and I went to this class, and I was not the only federal government person there, but there were people from all walks of life and all different professions, and I realized I wasn't alone. These people also were very afraid of ArcGIS Pro, and if you've ever opened it, it's a ribbon, and it's different, and it's like going from a Mac to a PC. It's really scary, and vice versa probably, right? So I realized very quickly that just maintaining relevance to the outside world wasn't going to be enough. I needed to liaise with my colleagues and bring what they were doing in and also bring it back out. So it's not a one-way street. Maintaining relevance goes both ways. If the public and private sector don't speak with one another, how can they stay on the same foot and understand each other? So relevance is a two-way street. Finally, I think that the thing that you really need to focus on with maintaining relevance is internally. My first job, I was the only GIS person. And in my current job, I'm surrounded by other geographers. But we all bring a different perspective to what we do. And there's a lot of different ways that you can manage those situations. And there's a lot of different skills that you need. Communication is absolutely one of them. And so I wanted to provide some insight on how to manage up with GIS. Unfortunately, my boss is here, so this is my managing up for GIS. Bringing case studies, maybe even having to explain what a case study is to your boss so that they can understand how this situation applies to our situation. So when you come with real and practical information to say, this is why we can do this in our situation. Come with a cost sheet. So this conference is important because it's cheaper than this class. This travel is important because it's cheaper than this conference. Being able to say it's more than 0 but less than 5,000 is really powerful. And then also, if you're asked for something that's not geography or GIS, bring geography and GIS anyways. Do what's asked of you, and then try to tack on a little extra. And then the next time, add a little bit more, and then add a little bit more. And people will start to realize the power of geography and GIS without even knowing it. You just get it in there, and they won't even realize. And then finally, you'll have a convert, and you'll have all these geographers around you, and it'll be wonderful. And then finally, bringing it to your colleagues. I call this donuts and spreadsheets. So it's really nice to wash down a spreadsheet with a donut. If you bring the donuts, they will come. And then your spreadsheets will turn into maps, and your maps will turn into analysis, and it'll be glorious. So there's always a way to maintain relevance for yourself. There's ways to bring relevance to other people. And I think that it's really powerful to bring in that public and private sector two-way street, but also internal to your organization, spread the word about geography and GIS and whatever it is that you have your passion about when it comes to your discipline, and people will come. Thank you.
All right, we're getting ready for a really short break. If we do about 5-ish, we can keep on time, and there's really good goodies to come afterwards, myself and my colleagues for our lightning talk, and then, of course, the invitation to come see all these wonderful geospatial-enabled materials in the Geography and Map Division. So, quick break, guys. All right, welcome back. My name is Dr. Paulette Hazier. You might remember me from such times as 5 hours ago. But today I'm putting on my quick presentation hat. I am the chief of the Geography and Map Division, and in 3 slides or less, I'm going to go through 250 years of cartography, specifically women's cartography. But the really good news is you're going to be able to see some of these examples when you come down for the open house in Geography and Map. So with further ado, so we start with some early women map makers. And when you think about early women map makers, they were mostly either women that were in families that were map makers. They might have been engravers, so the actual map might have been made by their father,
husband, uncle per se, and they actually did a lot of the engraving, but they did get credit for the engraving. You're going to see things like fortification maps. There were also educators, where you see with the Emma Willard map, the history of the United States or the Republic of America. I love the Republic of America. And you see also some plats and some plans. We also have some very colorful pictorial maps that were done early. So we're looking at, in this time frame, we're looking at anywhere between the 17th and the 18th century, going into the early 19th century. So you can see very early on, there are some contributions to cartography from women map makers. This is my favorite, and this is what I was going to do the whole talk on, but you wouldn't hear from me for way more than 5 minutes. So this is going to be quick. This is going to allude to something Mary said earlier about Marie Tharp. During World War II, the men were going off to war, and Congress actually passed an act and said, oh my gosh, we got to get people that are skilled in cartography and be able to make maps, because how the heck are we going to know where these folks are at, and situational awareness if nothing else. So there's these wonderful programs, and these are from our Prints and Photographs division, and we have a rep over here. But these are some of these early women map makers who actually got training, believe it or not, from the federal government in order to work on projects in the Farm Security Administration. I love the picture of the camouflaging class, learning how to make maps on camouflage. They also were employed through the WPA and some other of the other federal agencies. So this is where some of the women got their training in during the World War II. So let's skip ahead. I told you 250 years in 3 slides or less. And we're going to talk about 20th century women map makers. The one right here this is Anna Blunt's journey. I love this. She went on these journeys with her husband, and she's the first person to map the Arabian Desert. So she wasn't allowed to go by herself, of course. I think we had a number of presentations earlier that alluded to the fact that she wouldn't have been allowed probably to go at all. And she was a woman of means, of course, and she was allowed to go because of her husband. But I think, how cool is it to say you were like the first woman to, cross the Arabian Desert, I don't know. That's pretty cool to me. Next we have, and this is something that I think Mary talked about earlier as well, is we have a visual representation of one of Marie Tharp's maps, and this is, of course, the first woman, and I'll say woman. We'll leave Bruce off for a second. She is the first woman to map the ocean floor. So we do have examples of those for you to look at when you come down to see us at Geography and Map. So that was it. That was 250 years in 3 slides or less. I'm turning it over to someone else who can talk, and we're going to turn it over to Dr. Stephanie Sill, who's going to take it away and look at maps from a different perspective.
To be completely honest, I thought I was going last, so here we go. All right, so I'd like to begin with a little bit of a confession. And my confession is I am not a geographer, though I am a woman. So hopefully that counts. Okay, so I'm a rare books curator. So I'm coming to you today from a little bit different of a discipline. But I'm keenly interested in the intersection of cartography and geographic expression in rare books in all its sort of many forms. And today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the visual and conceptual articulations of geography by women in what's called the modern book arts genre, okay? And this may be new to some of you. I hope it is, because it's really neat. And I think that this is an important topic for sort of several reasons. For a very long time, women were largely absent from the world of printing, of graphic design, right, and of the arts in general. And so this is one small way that we can sort of bring that voice back into these fields. So just a very quick definition of what artist books are. They are really their own medium They can have a traditional book structure, or they can be very sculptural objects, and really everything in between. And the goal of an artist book is really the goal of any artwork, right? It's developing an aesthetic, it's telling personal stories, or making some type of political or social commentary. Right? And today I want to give you examples that speak certainly to the theme of geography. And these are all very cartographic. They're a little bit on the nose because we have 5 minutes. But there are several others that we could dive into that are much more sort of cultural geography in their articulation. So let's go ahead and get going. So this is 43, created by Robin Price. It explores the number 43 for very complex reasons that certainly I can get into later, but it mixes maps from locations along the 43rd parallel with excerpts from 86 books about exploration, as well as other topics as well. And these excerpts are sort of chosen according to this really interesting metric based on the number 43. The binding is also an expression of what is in the book, and this binding sort of comes out of itself. It's really fantastic. And so along the way, you encounter a compass and fractal patterns and a large-scale grid that sort of echoes the maps that are inside. Deep Time is one of my favorites. It came out in 2017. It explores the concept of erosion and sedimentation. And so the artist created these sort of maps of layered physical features of some of the highest points on the surface of the planet, including the Tibetan Plateau, the Andean mountain ranges. And as you sort of go through the book and you sort of displace the pages, you kind of experience the process of erosion and sedimentation. It's a really, for several reasons, it's a really beautiful work of art. This book is entitled Ingress Egress. It's a very meta book in many ways, in that it's an artist book that sort of contemplates the design and the purpose of an artist book. Right? And so it sort of settles on this theme of books are, right? And so books are architecture, right? The books are collections, they're environments, and they're also maps, right? And then gives a definition. A book provides a defined space and a visual system to explore an environment. So I think that this is an interesting idea, right? This idea of what is a map, what is a book, and how do these definitions sort of intersect at certain points. And last but not least is The City Within. And let me, because this is so unusual, we'll just go ahead and let that play for a second. So this artist investigates the structure of her own body in relation to urban surroundings, particularly the city of Montreal. The front and the back covers resemble a pelvic bone, and this sort of anchors a full rib cage, which it has this really fantastic accordion style. And on the inside of the ribs is a map of Montreal, over which Natalie is her name, has placed her own poetry about the city, and how the city has sort of become a part of her, and what she calls sort of under her skin, right? It's a really spectacular work that's relatively new. So in conclusion, right, there's a lot more here to talk about, right? I mean, we could just go endlessly into these books, but this is just a few examples of the way women have sort of used the medium of both cartography and books to find their voice for their own critical and often personal expression of the world around them. Thank you.
Last but not least, here we go. Okay. Hi, I'm Kathy Hart. I'm head of the Geography and Map Division Reading Room. And as we know, last but not least, I want to talk about careers in libraries. I am a librarian. I am not a geographer, although I want to be one, and I've taken classes, but I'm not quite there yet. I want to talk about the careers in libraries, though, because I know many, many geographers who have really great careers in libraries. And I have three that I'm going to point out. But basically, the big concept is
What does it take to be a librarian? Well, it takes a bachelor's degree in anything, and you add a master's degree in library science, library and information science. There's different configurations. And then you find an awesome job, such as here at the Library of Congress or your local university library. But I wanted to point out three people in particular who have either a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in geography, who have done really fabulous things to combine all the things that they've learned in their degree into meaningful, intellectual, creative work in their libraries. So the work of libraries, just to put it in a very short, not very condensed version, is the acquisition of materials, the organization of materials, instructing or how to use the materials, and like anything in that realm. So I want to jump over to my first individual, Mary Larsgaard, who, if you were in or near UC Santa Barbara in the 90s or even the 2000s, maybe prior to that, you may have run into her. She actually wrote the book. I have her book. She wrote the book on map librarianship. I have some show and tell here. In 3 editions. And she was a fabulous mentor. She unfortunately passed away just a couple of years ago, retired about 10 years ago. She was a leader in the field, both in how to organize material as far as, the traditional librarianship of collecting print maps, but she evolved into the world of cataloging and metadata, and taught classes, wrote articles, co-founded a journal which I actually also was a co-editor of, this journal, Map Geography Library. So if you have anyone you know that's interested in the career profession of map librarianship, this is a really great resource to kind of get an idea for what the big topics are. But Mary was fabulous. She was participating in the Alexandria Digital Library, which some of you may be familiar with from back in I guess the early 90s into 2000s, also in Santa Barbara, and active nationally in American Library Association, et cetera. But Mary was in the more traditional print map world. Over the last 20 years or so, map libraries have come to incorporate GIS data as well. And the next 2 people I want to talk about have integrated that. Marcy Bidney, she's up at she had started her career at Penn State, many years there. She's up now at University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. She's the curator of the American Geographical Society Library, the first woman curator of that collection. It had moved from New York 10 or so years ago. She's also active, one of the newer co-editors of this journal as well, but doing some very fabulous work, including a lot of her collection is aerial photos. So she's putting her geography degree to work in a map library, also with aerial photos, and doing things, collaborations on the international scale. Third, last on of the 3, Nicole Kong, she's coming into libraries from a GIS background, and she has a PhD in ecology, and her bachelor and master's is in geography, environmental science. She is not a librarian by training. She doesn't have the degree, but I want to point out that libraries have evolved as libraries have taken in the concept of GIS service and collections over the last 20 years. Some of those positions, instead of being, the master's degree librarian, they're often GIS specialists, so someone who may have a master's in a GIS. So if you're talking to students, or if you know someone that wants to be involved in academia, but maybe just the PhD is not their thing, they can be very involved and very active with a GIS degree. They can have collaborations. Nicole, for example, has multiple grants. She teaches credit classes, and she's collaborated on a variety of digital humanities projects, which is very much a growing thing, the geohumanities. And I want to also point out, she is one of the key leaders on a Big Ten Academic Alliance geoportal. So the work of pulling that data together across many libraries and organizations is really critical, and to have these individuals with this very in-depth understanding of geography and GIS makes these
collaborations and projects much more feasible and much more robust. So in conclusion, if you know of anyone that's looking at bachelor's and master's in geography, wants to be in a university setting, wants to be able to teach, maybe doesn't quite have the PhD, maybe that's not their thing, they can do a lot of that in a library environment and really make the most of their degree and have a really great career. So anyway, I think I'm done for now. And please join us at the open house. We'll be walking over there shortly.
So what a wonderful day. What a wonderful opportunity. I can't say enough about really the honor that we had in Geography and Math in the Library of Congress to help co-sponsor this conference with the Society for Women Geographers. I always want to say Southwest, don't ask why. There were some great speakers, and there has been a lot of time to hear about the careers in geography, about the history of the SWG, a little bit about cartography, because we had to slip that in, and enlightening talks by some of our fellow federal geographers and folks that are in the field. So again, I want a round of applause for everybody who spoke today.